Chapter 6. Why populism is sometimes good enough in practice, but not good enough in theory. Gerald Fitzgerald, the Irish ex-Prime Minister, once formulated a proper Hegelian reversal of the commonplace wisdom: this may be good for theory, but it is not good enough for practice. This may be good in practice, but it is not good enough in theory. This reversal best encapsulates the ambiguous position of populist politics. While it can sometimes be endorsed as part of a short-term pragmatic compromise, one should critically reject the notion in its fundamental dimension. The positive dimension of populism is its potential suspension of democratic rules. Democracy, in the way this term is used today, concerns above all formal legalism. Its minimal definition is unconditional adherence to a certain set of formal rules, which guarantee that antagonisms are fully absorbed into the agonistic game. Democracy means that whatever electoral manipulation took place, every political agent will unconditionally respect the results. In this sense, the US presidential elections of 2000 were effectively democratic in spite of obvious electoral manipulation, and of the patent meaninglessness of the fact that a couple hundred Florida voices decided who would be the president. The Democratic candidate accepted his defeat. In the weeks of uncertainty after the elections, Bill Clinton made an appropriate acerbic comment. "The American people have spoken. We just don't know what they said." This comment should be taken more seriously than it was meant. Even now we do not know it, and maybe because there was no substantial message behind the result at all. Jacques-Alain Miller has shown how democracy implies the barred big other. However, the Florida example demonstrates that, nonetheless, there is a big other which continues to exist in democracy, the procedural big other of electoral rules, which should be obeyed whatever the result. And it is this big other, this unconditional reliance on rules, that populism threatens to suspend. Which is why there is in populism always something violent, threatening, for the liberal view. An open or latent pressure, a warning that if elections are manipulated, the will of the people will have to find another way to impose itself. Even if electoral legitimization of power is respected, it is made clear that elections play a secondary role, that they serve only to confirm a political process whose substantial weight lies elsewhere. This is why the regime of Hugo Chavez in Venezuela is genuinely populist. Although it was legitimized by elections, it is clear that its exercise of power relies on a different dynamic: direct organization of the poor in favelas and other modes of local self-organization. This is what gives the thrill to populist regimes. The democratic rules are never fully endorsed. There is always an uncertainty that pertains to them. A possibility always looms that they will be redefined, unfairly changed in the middle of the game. This aspect of populism should be fully endorsed. The problem is not its undemocratic character, but its reliance on a substantial notion of the people. In populism, the big other, although potentially suspended in the guise of procedural formalism, returns in the guise of the people as the substantial agent legitimizing power. There are thus two elementary and irreducible sides to democracy: the violent egalitarian rise of the logic of those who are supernumerary, the part of no part, those who, while formally included within the social edifice, have no determinate place within it, and the regulated, more or less, universal procedure of choosing those who will exert power. How do these two sides relate to each other? What if democracy, in the second sense, the regulated procedure of registering the people's voice, is ultimately a defense against itself, against democracy in the sense of the violent intrusion of the egalitarian logic that disturbs the hierarchical functioning of the social edifice, an attempt to re-functionalize this excess, to make it a part of the normal running of the social edifice? However, the trap to be avoided here is to oppose these two poles as the good versus the bad. That is, to dismiss institutionalized democratic procedure as an ossification of a primordial democratic experience. What truly matters is precisely the degree to which the democratic explosion succeeds in becoming institutionalized, translated into social order. Not only are democratic explosions easily recuperated by those in power, since, the day after, people awaken to the sober reality of power relations, reinvigorated by fresh democratic blood, which is why those in power love explosions of creativity, like the French May 1968. Often, the ossified democratic procedure to which the majority continues to stick as to the dead letter is the only defense remaining against the onslaught of totalitarian passions of the crowd. The problem is thus how to regulate, institutionalize, the very violent egalitarian democratic impulse, how to prevent it being drowned in democracy in the second sense of the term, regulated procedure. If there is no way to do it, then authentic democracy remains a momentary utopian outburst which, on the proverbial morning after, has to be normalized. The harsh consequence to be accepted here is that this excess of egalitarian democracy over the democratic procedure can only institutionalize itself in the guise of its opposite, as revolutionary democratic terror. Good enough in practice. The 2005 French and Dutch no's to the project of the European Constitution were clear-cut cases of what, in French theory, is referred to as a floating signifier, a no of confused, inconsistent, overdetermined meanings, a kind of container in which the defense of workers' rights coexists with racism, in which the blind reaction to a perceived threat and fear of change coexist with vague utopian hopes. We are told that the French no was really a no to many other things, to Anglo-Saxon neoliberalism, to Chirac and his government, to the influx of immigrant workers from Poland who lower the wages of the French workers, and so on and so forth. The real struggle is going on now, namely the struggle for the meaning of this no. Who will appropriate it? Who, if anyone, will translate it into a coherent alternative political vision? If there is a predominant reading of the no, it is a new variation on the old Clinton motto. It's the economy, stupid. The no was supposedly a reaction to Europe's economic lethargy, falling behind with regard to other newly emerging blocks of economic power. Its economic, social, and ideologico-political inertia. But, paradoxically, an inappropriate reaction, a reaction on behalf of this very inertia, of privileged Europeans, of those who want to cling on to old welfare state privileges. It was the reaction of old Europe, triggered by the fear of any real change, the refusal of the uncertainties of the brave new world of globalist modernization. No wonder that the reaction of official Europe was one of near panic at the dangerous, irrational, racist and isolationist passions that sustained the no, at a parochial rejection of openness and liberal multiculturalism. One is used to hearing complaints about the growing apathy of the voters, about the decline of popular participation in politics. So worried liberals talk all the time about the need to mobilize people in the guise of civil society initiatives, to engage them more in a political process. However, when the people awaken from their apolitical slumber, it is a rule in the guise of a rightist populist revolt. No wonder many enlightened technocratic liberals now wonder whether the previous form of apathy was not a blessing in disguise. One should be attentive here to how even those elements which appear as pure rightist racism are in fact a displaced version of working-class protest. Of course, there is a form of racism in demanding an end to the immigration of foreign workers who pose a threat to employment. However, one should bear in mind the simple fact that the influx of immigrant workers from the post-communist countries is not the consequence of multiculturalist tolerance. It is indeed part of the strategy of capital to hold in check workers' demands. This is why, in the US, Bush did more for the legalization of the status of Mexican illegal immigrants than did the Democrats, caught up by labor union pressures. So, ironically, rightist racist populism is today the best argument, that the class struggle, far from being obsolete, goes on. The lesson the left should learn from it is that one should not commit the error symmetrical to that of the populist racist mystification, displacement of hatred onto foreigners, and to throw the baby out with the bathwater. That is, to merely oppose populist anti-immigration racism with multiculturalist openness, obliterating its displaced class content. Benevolent as it wants to be, the simple insistence on tolerance is the most perfidious form of anti-proletarian class struggle. Typical here is the reaction of German mainstream politicians to the formation of the new Linkspartei in the 2005 elections, a coalition of the East German PDS and leftist dissidents of the SPD. Joschka Fischer himself reached one of the lowest points in his career when he called Oskar Lafontaine a German Haider, because Lafontaine protested at the importation of cheap East European labour to lower the wages of German workers. The exaggerated and panicky way the political and even cultural establishment reacted when Lafontaine referred to foreign workers, or when the secretary of the SPD called the financial speculators locusts, is symptomatic, as if we were witnessing a full neo-Nazi revival. This total political blindness, this loss of the very capacity to distinguish left from right, betrays a panic at politicization as such. The automatic dismissal of entertaining any thoughts outside the established post-political coordinates as populist demagoguery is the hitherto purest proof that we effectively live under a new Denkverbot. It is not only that today's political field is polarized between post-political administration and populist politicization. Phenomena such as Berlusconi demonstrate how the two opposites can even coexist in the same party. Is the Berlusconi movement Forza Italia not a case of post-political populism? That is, of a mediatic administrative government legitimizing itself in populist terms? And does the same not hold to some degree even for the new Labour government in the UK, or for the Bush administration in the US? In other words, is populism not progressively replacing multiculturalist tolerance as the spontaneous ideological supplement to post-political administration, as its pseudo-concretization, its translation into a form that can appeal to individuals' immediate experience? The key fact here is that pure post-politics, a regime whose self-legitimization would be thoroughly technocratic, presenting itself as a competent administration, is inherently impossible. Any political regime needs a supplementary populist level of self-legitimization. This is why today's populism is different from the traditional version. What distinguishes it is the opponent against which it mobilizes the people. The rise of post-politics, the growing reduction of politics proper to the rational administration of conflicting interests. In the highly developed countries of the US and Western Europe, at least, populism is emerging as the inherent shadowy double of institutionalized post-politics. One is almost tempted to say, as its supplement, in the Derridian sense, as the arena in which political demands that do not fit the institutionalized space can be articulated. In this sense, there is a constitutive mystification that pertains to populism. Its basic gesture is to refuse to confront the complexity of the situation, to reduce it to a clear struggle with a pseudo-concrete enemy figure, from the Brussels bureaucracy to illegal immigrants. Populism is thus, by definition, a negative phenomenon, a phenomenon grounded in a refusal, even an implicit admission of impotence. We all know the old joke about a man looking for the key he has dropped under the streetlight. When asked where he lost it, he admits that it was in an ill-lit spot. So why is he looking for it here, under the light? Because the visibility is so much better here. There was always something of this trick in populism. So not only is populism not the arena within which today's emancipatory projects should inscribe themselves, but one should even go a step further and propose that the main task of contemporary emancipatory politics, its life and death problem, is to find a form of political mobilization that, while, like populism, critical of institutionalized politics, will avoid the populist temptation. where then does all this leave us with regard to Europe's imbroglio? The French voters were not given a clear, symmetrical choice, since the very terms of the choice privileged the yes. The elite proposed a choice to the people which was in fact no choice at all. People were called to ratify the inevitable, the result of enlightened expertise. The media and the political elite presented the choice as the one between knowledge and ignorance, between expertise and ideology, between post-political administration and the archaic political passions of the left and the right. The no was thus dismissed as a short-sighted reaction, unaware of its own consequences, a murky reaction of fear of the emerging new post-industrial global order, a conservative instinct to protect creaking welfare state structures, a gesture of refusal lacking any positive alternative program. No matter that the only political parties whose official stance was no were the parties at the opposite extremes of the political spectrum. Le Pen's Front National on the right, and the communists and Trotskyists on the left. However, even if there is an element of truth in all this, the very fact that the no was not sustained by a coherent alternative political vision is the strongest possible condemnation of the political and mediatic elite, a monument to their inability to articulate, to translate into a political vision, the people's longings and dissatisfactions. Indeed, in their reaction to the no, they treated the people as retarded pupils who had not learnt the lesson of the experts. Their self-criticism was the one of the teacher who admits that he failed to educate his students properly. What the advocates of this communication thesis, the French and Dutch no, means that the enlightened elite had failed to communicate adequately with the masses, fail to see is that, on the contrary, the no in question was a perfect example of communication in which, as Lacan put it, the speaker gets from the addressee its own message in its inverted, that is, true form. The enlightened European bureaucrats received from the electorate the shallowness of their own message to them in its true form. The project of European Union that was rejected by France and the Netherlands stood for a kind of cheap trick, as if Europe could redeem itself and beat its competitors by simply combining the best of both worlds, by beating the US, China, and Japan in scientific technological modernization through keeping alive its cultural traditions. One should insist here that if Europe is to redeem itself, it should, on the contrary, be ready to take the risk of losing, in the sense of radically questioning, both, dispelling the fetish of scientific technological progress and stop relying on the superiority of its cultural heritage. So, although the choice was not between two political options, it was also not the choice between the enlightened vision of a modern Europe, ready to fit into the new global order, and old, confused political passions. When commentators described the no as a message of bewilderment and fear, they were wrong. The main fear at issue here is the fear the no itself provoked in the new European elite, the fear that the people would no longer swallow their post-political vision. For the rest of us, the no is a message and expression of hope, hope that politics is still alive and possible, that the debate about what the new Europe shall and should be is still wide open. This is why we, on the left, should reject the sneering insinuation by liberals that, in our no, we find ourselves with strange neo-fascist bedfellows. What the new populist right and the left share is just one thing: the awareness that politics proper is still alive. There was a positive choice in the no, the choice of the choice itself, the rejection of the blackmail by the new elite, which offers us only the choice to confirm their expert knowledge, or to display one's irrational immaturity. The no is the positive decision to start a real political debate about what kind of Europe we really want. Late in his life, Freud asked the famous question, Was will das Weib? What does the woman want? Admitting his perplexity when faced with the enigma of feminine sexuality. Does the imbroglio with the European Constitution not bear witness to the same puzzlement? What kind of Europe do we want? The unofficial anthem of the European Union, heard at numerous political, cultural, and sporting public events, is the Ode to Joy, from the last movement of Beethoven's Ninth Symphony, a true empty signifier that can stand for anything. In France, it was elevated by Romain Rolland into a humanist ode to the brotherhood of all peoples, the Marseillaise of humanity. In 1938, it was performed as the high point of Reichsmusiktage, and later for Hitler's birthday. In the China of the Cultural Revolution, in the febrile context of a mass rejection of European classics, it was redeemed as a piece of progressive class struggle, while in contemporary Japan, it has achieved a cult status, being woven into the very social fabric with its supposed message of joy through suffering. Until the 1970s, that is, during the period when both West and East German Olympic teams had to perform together as one German team, the anthem played for German gold medalists was the Ode, and simultaneously the Rhodesian white supremacist regime of Ian Smith, which proclaimed independence in the late 1960s in order to maintain apartheid, also appropriated the same song as its national anthem. Even Abimael Guzman, the now imprisoned leader of Sendero Luminoso, when asked what music he loved, mentioned the fourth movement of Beethoven's Ninth. So it is easy to picture an imaginary performance at which all the sworn enemies, from Hitler to Stalin, from Bush to Saddam, forget their differences and participate in the same magic moment of ecstatic brotherhood. However, before we dismiss the fourth movement as a piece destroyed through social usage, let us note some peculiarities of its structure. In the middle of the movement, after we hear the main melody, the joy theme, in 3 orchestral and 3 vocal variations, at this first climax, something unexpected happens which has bothered critics over the last 180 years, ever since the first performance. At bar 331, the tone changes totally, and instead of the solemn hymnic progression, the same joy theme is repeated in Marsia Turca, Turkish march style, borrowed from the military music for wind and percussion instruments that 18th century European armies had adopted from the Turkish Janissaries. The mode is here that of a carnivalesque popular parade, a mocking spectacle. And after this point, everything goes wrong. The simple solemn dignity of the first part of the movement is never recovered. After this Turkish part, and in a clear counter-movement to it, in a kind of retreat into inner religiosity, the choral-like music, dismissed by some critics as a Gregorian fossil, tries to depict the ethereal image of millions of people who kneel down embracing one another, contemplating the distant sky in awe and searching for the loving paternal God who must dwell above the canopy of stars. Überm Sternenzelt muss ein lieber Wetter hornen. However, the music, as it were, gets stuck when the word muss, first rendered by the basses, is repeated by the tenors and altos, and finally by the sopranos, as if this repeated conjuration is a desperate attempt to convince us, and itself, of what it knows is not true, turning the line, "A loving father must dwell," into a desperate act of beseechment, and thus attesting to the fact that there is nothing beyond the canopy of stars, no loving father to protect us and to guarantee our brotherhood. After this, a return to a more celebratory mood is attempted in the guise of the double fugue, which cannot but sound false in its excessively artificial brilliance. A fake synthesis, if there ever was one. A desperate attempt to cover up the void of the absent God revealed in the previous section. But the final cadenza is the strangest of them all, sounding less like Beethoven than a puffed-up version of the finale of Mozart's Abduction from Seraglio, combining the Turkish elements with the fast Rococo spectacle. And let us not forget the principal lesson of this Mozart opera. The figure of the Oriental despot is presented there as a true enlightened master. The finale is thus a bizarre mixture of Orientalism and regression into late 18th century classicism, a double retreat from the historical present, a silent admission of the purely phantasmatic character of the joy of all-encompassing brotherhood. If there ever was a music that literally deconstructs itself, this is it. The contrast between the highly ordered linear progression of the first part of the movement and the precipitous, heterogeneous, and inconsistent character of the second cannot be stronger. No wonder that already in 1826, 2 years after the first performance, some reviewers described the finale as a festival of hatred towards all that can be called human joy. With gigantic strength, the perilous horde emerges, tearing hearts asunder and darkening the divine spark of gods with noisy, monstrous mocking. Beethoven's Ninth is thus full of what Nicholas Cook called unconsummated symbols, elements which are in excess of the global meaning of the work, or of the movement in which they occur, which do not fit this meaning, although it is not clear what additional meaning they bring. Cook lists the funeral march at bar 513 of the first movement, the abrupt ending of the second movement, the military tones in the third movement, the so-called horror fanfares, the Turkish march, and many other moments in the fourth movement. All these elements vibrate with an implied significance that overflows the musical scenario. It is not simply that their meaning should be uncovered through attentive interpretation. The very relationship between texture and meaning is inverted here. If the predominant musical scenario seems to set to music a clear pre-established meaning, the celebration of joy, universal brotherhood, here the meaning is not given in advance, but seems to float in some kind of virtual indeterminacy. It is as if we know that there is, or rather has to be, some meaning, without ever being able to establish what this meaning is. What then is the solution? The only radical solution is to shift the entire perspective and to render problematic the first part of the fourth movement. Things do not really go wrong only at bar 331 with the entrance of the Marcia Turca. They go wrong from the very start. One should accept that there is something of an insipid sham in the ode, so that the chaos that enters after bar 331 is a kind of return of the repressed, a symptom of what was wrong from the very beginning. What if we have domesticated the ode to joy too much? What if we have got all too used to it as a symbol of joyful brotherhood? What if we should confront it anew, reject in it what is false? Many of today's listeners cannot be struck by the empty, pompous character and pretentiousness of the ode, by its somewhat ridiculous solemnity. Recall what we see if we watch its performance on television. Fat, self-satisfied, well-dressed singers with bulging veins making a great effort, accompanied by a ridiculous waving of hands, to get their sublime message through as loudly as possible. What if these listeners are simply right? What if the true obscenity is what takes place before the Marcia Turca, not after it? What if we displace the entire perspective and perceive the Marcia as a return to everyday normality that cuts short the display of preposterous portentousness and thus brings us back to earth, as if it were saying, "You want to celebrate the brotherhood of men? Here it is then, real humanity." And does the same not hold for Europe today? After inviting millions, from the highest to the lowest, the worm, to embrace, the second strophe ominously ends, "But he who cannot rejoice, let him steal weeping away." The irony of Beethoven's Ode to Joy as the unofficial European anthem is, of course, that the main cause of today's crisis of the Union is precisely Turkey. According to most of the polls, one of the reasons motivating those who voted no in the last referendums in France and Netherlands was their opposition to Turkish membership. The no can be grounded in rightist populist terms. No to the Turkish threat to our culture, no to Turkish cheap immigrant labor. Or in liberal multiculturalist terms, Turkey should not be allowed in because, in its treatment of the Kurds, it does not display sufficient respect for human rights. And the opposite view, the yes, is as false as Beethoven's final cadenza. The case of contemporary Turkey is crucial for a proper understanding of capitalist globalization. The political proponent of globalization is the ruling moderate Islamist party of the Prime Minister Erdogan. It is the ferociously nationalist and secular Kemalists who, focused on the fully sovereign nation state, resist full integration into the global space, and also have misgivings about Turkey joining the European Union, while the Islamists find it easy to combine their religious cultural identity with economic globalization. Insisting on one's particular cultural identity is no obstacle to globalization. The true obstacle is the trans-cultural nation-state universalism. So, should Turkey be allowed into the Union? Or should it be let to steal itself weeping out of the Union? Bund. Can Europe survive the Turkish march? And, as in the finale of Beethoven's Ninth, what if the true problem is not Turkey, but the basic melody itself, the song of European unity as it is played to us by the Brussels post-political technocratic elite? What we need is a totally new melody, a new definition of Europe itself. The problem of Turkey, the perplexity of the European Union as to what to do about Turkey, is not about Turkey as such, but a confusion about what Europe itself is. What, then, is Europe's predicament today? Europe is caught between the great pincers of America on the one side and China on the other. America and China, seen metaphysically, are both the same, the identical hopeless frenzy of unchained technology and of the rootless organization of the average man. When the farthest corner of the globe has been conquered technically and can be exploited economically, when any incident you like, in any place you like, at any time you like, becomes accessible as fast as you like, when, through TV live coverage, you can simultaneously experience a battle in the Iraqi desert and an opera performance in Beijing, when, in a global digital network, time is nothing but speed, instantaneity, and simultaneity, when a winner in a reality TV show counts as the great man of the people, then yes, still looming like a spectre over all this uproar are the questions. What is it for? Where are we going? What is to be done? There is thus a need, amongst us Europeans, for what Heidegger called Auseinandersetzung, interpretive confrontation, with others as well as with Europe's own past in its totality, from its ancient and Judeo-Christian roots to the recently deceased welfare state idea. Europe is today split between the so-called Anglo-Saxon model, accept modernization, adaptation to the rules of the new global order, and the Franco-German model, save as much as possible of the old European welfare state. Although opposed, these two options are two sides of the same coin, and our true path is not to return to any idealized form of the past, for these models are clearly exhausted, nor to convince Europeans that if we are to survive as a world power, we should accommodate ourselves as fast as possible to recent trends of globalization. Nor should we be tempted by what is arguably the worst option, the search for a creative synthesis between European traditions and globalization, with the aim of constructing something one is tempted to call globalization with a European face. Every crisis is in itself a stimulus for a new beginning. Every collapse of short-term strategic and pragmatic measures for the financial reorganization of the Union, etc., a blessing in disguise, an opportunity to rethink its very foundations. What we need is a retrieval through repetition, Wiederholung, through a critical confrontation with the entire European tradition. One should repeat the question, what is Europe? Or rather, what does it mean for us to be Europeans, and thus formulate a new beginning? The task is difficult. It compels us to take the great risk of stepping into the unknown, yet its only alternative is slow decay, the gradual transformation of Europe into what Greece was for the mature Roman Empire, a destination for nostalgic cultural tourism with no effective relevance. The conflict on Europe is usually portrayed as one between Eurocentric Christian hardliners and liberal multiculturalists who want to open the doors of the European Union much more widely, to Turkey and beyond. What if this conflict is the wrong one? What if cases like Poland should compel us to narrow entry, to redefine Europe in such a way that it would exclude Polish Christian fundamentalism? Maybe it is time to apply to Poland the same criteria as to Turkey. The high-class mazurka should make us no less suspicious than the low-class Turkish march. The lesson is thus clear. Fundamentalist populism is filling in the void of the absence of a leftist dream. Donald Rumsfeld's infamous statement about the old and the new Europe is acquiring a new unexpected actuality. The contours are emerging of the new Europe, of the majority of post-communist countries, Poland, the Baltic countries, Romania, Hungary, with their Christian populist fundamentalism, belated anti-communism, xenophobia and homophobia, and so on. A further point apropos of which we should risk the hypothesis that Heidegger was right, although not in the sense he meant it, is, what if democracy is not the answer to this predicament? In his notes towards definition of culture, the great conservative T.S. Eliot remarked that there are moments when the only choice is the one between sectarianism and non-belief, when the only way to keep a religion alive is to engage in a sectarian split from its main body. This is our only chance today. Only by means of a sectarian split from the standard European legacy, by cutting ourselves off from the decaying corpse of old Europe, can we keep the renewed European legacy alive. Such a split should render problematic the very premises that we tend to accept as our destiny, as non-negotiable facts of our predicament. The phenomenon usually designated as the global New World Order, and the need, through modernization, to accommodate ourselves to it. To put it bluntly, if the emerging New World Order is the irrefragable framework for all of us, then Europe is lost. So the only solution for Europe is to take the risk and break this spell of destiny. Nothing should be accepted as inviolable in this new refoundation. Neither the need for economic modernization, nor the most sacred liberal and democratic fetishes. So, although the French and Dutch no is not sustained by a coherent and detailed alternative vision, it at least clears the space for it, opening up a void which demands to be filled in with new projects, in contrast to the pro-constitution stance which effectively precludes thinking, presenting us with an administrative political fait accompli. The message of the French no to all of us who care about Europe is no. Anonymous experts whose merchandise is sold to us in brightly colored, liberal multiculturalist packages will not prevent us from thinking. It is time for us, citizens of Europe, to become aware that we have to make a properly political decision about what we want. No enlightened administrator will do the job for us. Good enough in practice, but not good enough in theory. The French-Dutch no thus presents us with the latest chapter in the story of populism. For the enlightened liberal technocratic elite, populism is inherently proto-fascist, the demise of political reason, a revolt in the guise of an outburst of blind utopian passions. The easiest reply to this distrust would be to claim that populism is inherently neutral, a kind of transcendental formal political dispositif that can be incorporated into different political engagements. This option has been elaborated in detail by Ernesto Laclau. For Laclau, in a nice case of self-referentiality, the very logic of hegemonic articulation applies also to the conceptual opposition between populism and politics. Populism is the Lacanian objet A of politics, the particular figure which stands for the universal dimension of the political, which is why it is the royal road to understanding the political. Hegel provided a term for this overlapping of the universal with part of its own particular content: oppositional determination. Gegensätzliche Bestimmung, as the point at which the universal genus encounters itself among its particular species. Populism is not a specific political movement, but the political at its purest, the inflection of the social space that can affect any political content. Its elements are purely formal, transcendental, not ontic. Populism occurs when a series of particular democratic demands for better social security, health services, lower taxes, against war, and so on, is enchained in a series of equivalences, and this enchainment produces the people as the universal political subject. What characterizes populism is not the ontic content of these demands, but the mere formal fact that, through their enchainment, the people emerge as a political subject, and all different particular struggles and antagonisms appear as parts of a global antagonistic struggle between us, the people, and them. Again, the content of us and them is not prescribed in advance, but precisely the stake of the struggle for hegemony. Even ideological elements such as brutal racism and anti-Semitism can be enchained in a populist series of equivalences in the way them is constructed. It is clear now why Laclau prefers populism to class struggle. Populism provides a neutral, transcendental matrix of an open struggle whose content and stakes are themselves defined by the contingent struggle for hegemony, while class struggle presupposes a particular social group, the working class, as a privileged political agent. This privilege is not the outcome of hegemonic struggle, but grounded in the objective social position of this group. The ideologico-political struggle is thus ultimately reduced to an epiphenomenon of objective social processes, powers, and their conflicts. For Laclau, on the contrary, the fact that some particular struggle is elevated into the universal equivalent of all struggles is not a predetermined fact, but itself the result of the contingent political struggle for hegemony. In some constellations, this struggle can be the workers' struggle. In other constellations, the patriotic anti-colonialist struggle. In yet others, the anti-racist struggle for cultural tolerance. There is nothing in the inherent positive qualities of some particular struggle that predestines it for such a hegemonic role as the general equivalent of all struggles. The struggle for hegemony thus not only presupposes an irreducible gap between the universal form and the multiplicity of particular contents, but also the contingent process by means of which one among these contents is transubstantiated into the immediate embodiment of the universal dimension. Say, Laclau's own example, in the Poland of 1980, the particular demands of Solidarność were elevated into the embodiment of the people's global rejection of the communist regime, so that all different versions of the anti-communist opposition, from the conservative nationalist opposition through the liberal democratic version and cultural dissidents to leftist workers' protests, recognize themselves in the empty signifier Solidarność. This is how Laclau tries to distinguish his position both from gradualism, which reduces the very dimension of the political. All that remains is the gradual realization of particular democratic demands within the differential social space, as well as from the opposite idea of a total revolution that would bring about a fully self-reconciled society. What both extremes miss is the struggle for hegemony, in which a particular demand is elevated to the dignity of the thing, that is, comes to stand for the universality of the people. The field of politics is thus caught in an irreducible tension between empty and floating signifiers. Some particular signifiers start to function as empty, directly embodying the universal dimension, incorporating into the chain of equivalences which they totalize, a large number of floating signifiers. Laclau mobilizes this gap between the ontological need for a populist protest vote, conditioned by the fact that the hegemonic power discourse cannot incorporate a series of popular demands, and the contingent ontic content to which this vote gets attached, to explain the supposed shift of many French voters who, till the 1970s, supported the Communist Party rather than the rightist populism of the Front National. The elegance of the solution is that it releases us from the tiresome topic of the alleged deeper, totalitarian, of course, solidarity between the far right and the extreme left. Although Leclerc's theory of populism stands out as one of today's great, and unfortunately for social theory, rare examples of true conceptual stringency, one should note a couple of problematic features. The first concerns his very definition of populism. The series of formal conditions he enumerates are not sufficient to justify calling a phenomenon populist. What needs to be added is the way the populist discourse displaces the antagonism and constructs the enemy. In populism, the enemy is externalized, reified, into a positive ontological entity, even if this entity is spectral, whose annihilation would restore balance and justice. Symmetrically, our own, the populist political agent's, identity is also perceived as pre-existing the enemy's onslaught. Let us take Leclerc's own precise analysis of why one should count Chartism as populism. Its dominant leitmotif is to situate the evils of society not in something that is inherent in the economic system, but quite the opposite. In the abuse of power by parasitic and speculative groups which have control of political power, old corruption in Cobbett's words. It was for this reason that the feature most strongly picked out in the ruling class was its idleness and parasitism. In other words, for a populist, the cause of the trouble is ultimately never the system as such, but the intruder who corrupted it, financial manipulators, not capitalists as such, etc. Not a flaw inscribed into the structure as such, but an element that does not play its part within the structure properly. For a Marxist, on the contrary, as for a Freudian, the pathological, the deviant misbehavior of some elements, is the symptom of the normal, an indicator of what is wrong in the very structure that is threatened with pathological outbursts. For Marx, economic crises are the key to understanding the normal functioning of capitalism. For Freud, pathological phenomena such as hysterical outbursts provide the key to the constitution and hidden antagonisms that sustain the functioning of a normal subject. This is also why fascism definitely is a populism. Its figure of the Jew is the equivalential point of the series of heterogeneous, inconsistent even, threats experienced by individuals. The Jew is simultaneously too intellectual, dirty, sexually voracious, hard-working, financially exploitative. Here we encounter another key feature of populism not mentioned by Leclerc. Not only is, as he is right to emphasize, the populist master signifier for the enemy empty, vague, imprecise, and so on. To say that the oligarchy is responsible for the frustration of social demands is not to state something which can possibly be read out of the social demands themselves. It is to provide from outside those social demands by a discourse on which they can be inscribed. It is here that the moment of emptiness necessarily arises, following the establishment of equivalential bonds, ergo vagueness and imprecision. But these do not result from any kind of marginal or primitive situation. They are inscribed in the very nature of the political. In populism proper, this abstract character is, furthermore, always supplemented by the pseudo-concreteness of the figure that is selected as the enemy, the singular agent behind all the threats to the people. One can today buy laptops with a keyboard that artificially imitates the resistance to the fingers of the old typewriter, as well as the typewriter sound of the key hitting the paper. What better example of the recent need for pseudo-concreteness? Today, when not only social relations but also technology are becoming more and more opaque, who can visualize what goes on inside a PC? There is a great thirst to recreate an artificial concreteness in order to enable individuals to relate to their complex environs as if it were a meaningful life world. In computer programming, this was the step accomplished by Apple, the pseudo-concreteness of icons on the desktop. Guy Debord's old formula about the society of spectacle is thus receiving a new twist. Images are created in order to fill in the gap that separates the new artificial universe from our old life world surroundings. That is, to domesticate this new universe. And is the pseudo-concrete populist figure of the Jew that condenses the vast multitude of anonymous forces that determine us, not analogous to a computer keyboard that imitates the old typewriter keyboard. The Jew as the enemy definitely emerges from outside the realm of social demands that experience themselves as frustrated. This supplement to Lacau's definition of populism in no way implies any kind of regression to the ontic level. We remain at the formal ontological level, and while accepting Lacau's thesis that populism is a certain formal political logic, not bound to any content, simply supplement it with the characteristic, no less transcendental than its other features, of reifying antagonism into a positive entity. As such, populism, by definition, contains a minimum, an elementary form, of ideological mystification, which is why, although it is effectively a formal frame, matrix, of political logic that can be given different political twists, reactionary nationalists, progressive nationalists, nonetheless, insofar as it displaces, in its very notion, the immanent social antagonism into the antagonism between the unified people and its external enemy, it harbors, in the last instance, a long-term proto-fascist tendency. In short, I agree with Lacau's attempt to define populism in a formal conceptual way, also taking note of how, in his last book, he has clearly shifted his position from radical democracy to populism. He now reduces democracy to the moment of democratic demand within the system. However, as is clear to him, populism can also be very reactionary. So how are we to draw a line here? So, again, is there a way to draw the line at a formal conceptual level? My wager is that the answer is yes. Every construction of and action on behalf of the people as a political subject is not eo ipso populism. In the same way that Laclau likes to emphasize that society does not exist, nor does the people. And the problem with populism is that within its horizon, the people does exist. The people's existence is guaranteed by its constitutive exception, by the externalization of the enemy into a positive intruder, obstacle. The formula of a truly democratic reference to the people should thus be a paraphrase of Kant's definition of beauty as Zweckmäßigkeit obnijuik, the popular without the people, namely the popular cleft, thwarted by a constitutive antagonism which prevents it from acquiring the full substantial identity of a people. That is why populism, far from standing for the political as such, always involves a minimal depoliticization, naturalization of the political. This accounts for the fundamental paradox of authoritarian fascism, which is that it almost symmetrically inverts what Chantal Mouffe calls the democratic paradox. If the wager of institutionalized democracy is to integrate the antagonistic struggle itself into the institutional differential space, transforming it into regulated agonism, fascism proceeds in the opposite direction. While fascism, in its mode of activity, brings the antagonistic logic to its extreme, talking about the struggle to death between itself and its enemies, and always maintaining, if not realizing, a minimal extra-institutional threat of violence, of direct pressure of the people, bypassing the complex legal institutional channels. It posits as its political goal precisely the opposite, an extremely ordered hierarchical social body. No wonder that fascism always relies on organicist, corporatist metaphors. This contrast can be nicely rendered in terms of the Lacanian opposition between the subject of enunciation and the subject of the enunciated, content. While democracy admits antagonistic struggle as its goal, in Lacanese as its enunciated, its content, its procedure is regulated systemic. Fascism, on the contrary, tries to impose the goal of hierarchically structured harmony through the means of an unbridled antagonism. In a homologous way, the ambiguity of the middle class, this contradiction embodied, as Marx put it apropos of Proudhon, is best exemplified by the way it relates to politics. On the one hand, the middle class is against politicization. It just wants to sustain its way of life, to be left to work and live its life in peace, which is why it tends to support the authoritarian coups, which promise to put an end to the crazy political mobilization of society, so that everyone can return to his or her work. On the other hand, members of the middle class, in the guise of the threatened patriotic, hard-working moral majority, are the main instigators of grassroots mass mobilization in the guise of rightist populism. For example, in France today, the only force that truly disturbs the post-political, technocratic humanitarian administration is Le Pen's Front National. Populism is ultimately always sustained by ordinary people's frustrated exasperation, by a cry of, "I don't know what's going on. I just know I've had enough of it. It can't go on. It must stop." An impatient outburst, a refusal to understand, exasperation at complexity, and the ensuing conviction that there must be somebody responsible for all the mess, which is why an agent who is behind the scenes and explains it all is required. Therein, in this refusal to know, resides the properly fetishistic dimension of populism. That is to say, although at a purely formal level, the fetish involves a gesture of transference onto the fetish object, it functions as an exact inversion of the standard formula of transference, with the subject supposed to know. What the fetish gives body to is precisely my disavowal of knowledge, my refusal to subjectively assume what I know. Therein resides the contrast between the fetish and the symptom. A symptom embodies a repressed knowledge, the truth about the subject that the subject is not ready to accept. This is why Freud engaged in speculating on how the fetish is the last object seen before stumbling upon the fact that women do not have penises. It is the last support of the subject's ignorance. Linked to this are some further weaknesses of Leclerc's analysis. The smallest unit of his analysis of populism is the category of the social demand, in the double meaning of the term, a request and a claim. The strategic reason for choosing this term is clear. The subject of the demand is constituted through raising this demand. The people thus constitutes itself through an equivalential chain of demands. It is the performative result of raising these demands, not a pre-existing group. Leclerc calls such an elementary demand, prior to its eventual enchainment into a series of equivalences, democratic. In his slightly idiosyncratic usage, such a term refers to a demand that functions within the socio-political system. In other words, it is encountered as a particular demand rather than being frustrated and, thus, forced to inscribe itself into an antagonistic series of equivalences. Although he emphasizes how, in a normal, institutionalized political space, there are, of course, multiple conflicts. But these conflicts are dealt with one by one, without setting in motion any transversal alliances, antagonisms. Leclerc was well aware that chains of equivalences can also form themselves within an institutionalized democratic space. Recall how, in the UK, under John Major's conservative leadership in the 1980s, the figure of the unemployed single mother was elevated into the universal symbol of what was wrong with the old welfare state system. All social evils were somehow reduced to this figure. Why is there a state budget crisis? Because too much money is spent on supporting these mothers and their children. Juvenile delinquency, because single mothers do not exert enough authority to provide proper educational discipline, and so on and so forth. What Leclerc neglected to emphasize is not only the uniqueness of democracy with regard to his basic conceptual opposition between the logic of differences, society is a global regulated system, and the logic of equivalences, the social space as split into two antagonistic camps, which equalize their inner differences, but also the full inner entwinement of these two logics. The first thing we should note here is how, only in a democratic political system, the antagonistic logic of equivalences is inscribed into the very political system as its basic structural feature. It seems that Mouffe's work is here more pertinent in its heroic attempt to bring together democracy and the spirit of agonistic struggle, rejecting both extremes. On the one side, the celebration of heroic struggle confrontation that suspends democracy and its rules, Nietzsche, Heidegger, Schmidt. On the other side, the evacuation of true struggle from the democratic space, so that all that remains is anemic, rule-regulated competition, Habermas. Here, Mouffe is right to point out that violence returns with a vengeance, in the exclusion of those who do not fit the rules of unconstrained communication. However, the main threat to democracy in today's democratic countries resides in neither of these two extremes, but in the death of the political through the commodification of politics. What is at stake here is not primarily the way politicians are packaged and sold as merchandise at elections. A much deeper problem is that elections themselves are conceived along the lines of buying a commodity, power in this case. They involve a competition between different merchandise parties, and our votes are like money, which buys the government we want. What gets lost in such a view of politics as just another service we buy is politics as a shared public debate of issues and decisions that concern us all. Thus, democracy, it seems, not only can include antagonism, it is the only political form that solicits and presupposes it, that institutionalizes it. What other political systems perceive as a threat, the lack of a natural pretender to power, democracy elevates into a normal, positive condition of its functioning. The place of power is empty. There is no natural claimant for it. Polemos struggle is irreducible, and every government must be fought out, gained through polemos. This is why Leclerc's critical remark about Lefort misses the point. Quote, "For Lefort, the place of power in democracies is empty. For me, the question poses itself differently. It is a question of producing emptiness out of the operation of hegemonic logic. For me, emptiness is a type of identity, not a structural location." End quote. The two emptinesses are simply not comparable. The emptiness of the people is the emptiness of the hegemonic signifier, which totalizes the chain of equivalences. That is, whose particular content is transubstantiated into an embodiment of the social whole, while the emptiness of the place of power is a distance which renders every empirical bearer of power deficient, contingent, and temporary. The conclusion to be drawn is that populism, in the manner we have supplemented Leclerc's definition of it, is not the only mode of existence of the excess of antagonism over the institutional democratic framework of regulated agonistic struggle. Not only the now defunct communist revolutionary organizations, but also the wide-scale phenomena of non-institutionalized social and political protest, from the student movements of the late 1960s and early 1970s to later anti-war protests, and the more recent anti-globalization movement, cannot be properly called populist. Exemplary is here the case of the anti-segregation movement in the US in the late 1950s and early 1960s, epitomized by the name of Martin Luther King. Although it endeavored to articulate a demand that was not properly met within the existing democratic institutions, it cannot be called populist in any meaningful sense of the term. The way it led the struggle and constituted its opponent was simply not populist. A more general remark should be made here about the single-issue popular movements, for example, the tax revolts in the US. Although they function in a populist manner, mobilizing the people around a demand which is not met by the democratic institutions, they do not seem to rely on a complex chain of equivalences, but remain focused on one singular demand. The determining role of economy. Marx with Freud. The topic of populism versus class struggle also raises a series of fundamental conceptual problems. Let us begin with a precise theoretical point about the status of universality. We are dealing here with two opposed logics of universality to be strictly distinguished. On the one hand, there is the state bureaucracy as the universal class of a society, or in a larger scope, the US as the world policeman, the universal enforcer and guarantor of human rights and democracy, the direct agent of the global order. On the other hand, there is supernumerary universality, the universality embodied in the element which sticks out of the existing order, which, while internal to it, has no proper place within it, what Jacques Rancière calls the part of no part. Not only are the two not the same, but the struggle is ultimately a struggle between these two universalities, not simply between the particular elements of the universality. Not just about which particular content will hegemonize the empty form of universality, but a struggle between two exclusive forms of universality themselves. This is why Leclerc misses the point when he opposes the working class and the people along the axis of conceptual content versus the effect of radical nomination. The working class designates a pre-existing social group characterized by its substantial content, while the people emerges as a unified agent through the very act of nomination. There is nothing in the heterogeneity of demands that predisposes them to be unified into a people. However, Marx distinguishes between the working class and the proletariat. The working class is indeed a particular social group, while the proletariat designates a subjective position. This is why Leclerc's critical debate about Marx's opposition between proletariat and lumpenproletariat also misses the point. The distinction is not one between an objective social group and a non-group, a remainder excess with no proper place within the social edifice, but a distinction between two modes of this remainder excess, which generate two different subjective positions. The implication of Marx's analysis is that, paradoxically, although the lumpenproletariat seems more radically displaced with regard to the social body than the proletariat, it in fact fits much more smoothly into the social edifice. To refer to the Kantian distinction between negative and infinite judgment, the lumpenproletariat is not truly a non-group, the imminent negation of a group which is a non-group, but not a group, and its exclusion from all strata not only consolidates the identity of other groups, but makes it a free-floating element, which can be used by any stratum or class. It can be the radicalizing carnivalesque element of the workers' struggle, pushing them from compromising moderate strategies to an open confrontation, or the element which is used by the ruling class to denature from within opposition to its rule. The long tradition of the criminal mob serving those in power. The working class, on the contrary, is a group which is in itself, as a group within the social structure, a non-group, that is, whose position is in itself contradictory. It is a productive force. Society and those in power need it in order to reproduce themselves and their rule, but nonetheless, they cannot find a proper place for it. Based on this misunderstanding, Leclerc puts forward a general argument rendered succinctly by Oliver Marchart. On a formal level, every politics is based on the articulatory logics of a combination and condensation of inconsistent attitudes, not only the politics of fascism. As a result, the fundamental social antagonism will always be displaced to some degree since, as we have noted earlier, the ontological level, in this case antagonism, can never be approached directly and without political mediation. It follows that distortion is constitutive for every politics. Politics as such, not only fascist politics, proceeds through distortion. This reproach remains caught in the binary tension between essence and appearance. The fundamental antagonism never appears as such. Directly, in a transparent manner, in Marx's terms, the pure revolutionary situation, in which all social tensions would be simplified, reduced to the class struggle, never takes place. It is always mediated by other, ethnic, religious, etc., antagonisms. So the essence never appears directly, but always in a displaced, distorted way. While this statement is in principle true, there are at least two things to add to it. First, if this is the case, why even continue to talk about a fundamental social antagonism? All we have here is a series of antagonisms which can build a chain of equivalences, metaphorically contaminating each other. And which antagonism emerges as central is the contingent result of a struggle for hegemony. So does this mean that one should reject the very notion of fundamental antagonism, as Leclerc does? I would propose a Hegelian answer. Let me make this point clear by yet again referring to one of my standard examples, Levi Strauss's exemplary analysis, from his structural anthropology, of the spatial disposition of buildings among the Winnebago, one of the Great Lake tribes. The tribe is divided into two subgroups, moieties, those who are from above and those who are from below. When we ask an individual to draw on a piece of paper or on sand the ground plan of her village, the spatial disposition of cottages, we obtain two quite different answers, depending on her relationship to one or the other subgroup. Both perceive the village as a circle, but for one subgroup there is within this circle another circle of central houses, so that we have two concentric circles. While for the other subgroup the circle is split into two by a clear dividing line. In other words, a member of the first subgroup, let us call it conservative corporatist, perceives the ground plan of the village as a ring of houses more or less symmetrically disposed around the central temple, whereas a member of the second, revolutionary antagonistic subgroup, perceives her village as two distinct heaps of houses separated by an invisible frontier. The point Levi Strauss wants to make is that this example should in no way entice us into cultural relativism, according to which the perception of social space depends on the observer's group belonging. The very split into the two relative perceptions implies a hidden reference to a constant, not the objective, actual disposition of buildings, but a traumatic kernel, a fundamental antagonism the inhabitants of the village were unable to symbolize, to account for, to internalize, to come to terms with. An imbalance in social relations that prevented the community from stabilizing itself into a harmonious whole. The two perceptions of the ground plan are simply two mutually exclusive endeavors to cope with this traumatic antagonism, to heal its wound via the imposition of a balanced symbolic structure. It is here that one can see in what precise sense the real intervenes through anamorphosis. We have first the actual, objective arrangement of the houses, and then its two different symbolizations, which both distort, in an anamorphic way, the actual arrangement. However, the real is here not the actual arrangement, but the traumatic core of the social antagonism, which distorts the tribe member's view of the actual antagonism. The real is thus the disavowed X, on account of which our vision of reality is anamorphically distorted. It is simultaneously the thing to which direct access is not possible, and the obstacle which prevents this direct access. The thing which eludes our grasp, and the distorting screen which makes us miss the thing. More precisely, the real is ultimately the very shift of perspective from the first to the second standpoint. The Lacanian real is not only distorted, but the very principle of the distortion of reality. This three-level dispositif is strictly homologous to Freud's three-level dispositif of the interpretation of dreams. For Freud, too, unconscious desire in a dream is not simply its core, which never appears directly, distorted by the translation into the manifest dream text, but the very principle of this distortion. This is how, for Deleuze, in a strict conceptual homology, the economy exerts its role of determining the social structure in the last instance. The economy in this role is never directly present as an actual causal agent. Its presence is purely virtual. It is the social pseudo-cause, but precisely as such, absolute, non-relational, the absent cause, something that is never in its own place. That is why the economic is never given properly speaking, but rather designates a differential virtuality to be interpreted, always covered over by its forms of actualization. It is the absent X which circulates between the multiple series of the social field, economic, political, ideological, legal, distributing them in their specific articulation. One should thus insist on the radical difference between the economic as this virtual X, the absolute point of reference of the social field, and the economic in its actuality, as one of the elements, subsystems, of the actual social totality. When they encounter each other, that is, when the virtual economic encounters in the guise of its actual counterpart, itself, in its oppositional determination, this identity coincides with absolute self-contradiction. As Lacan put it in his Seminar 11, Il n'y a de cause que de ce qui cloche. There is no cause but a cause of something that stumbles, slips, falters. A thesis whose obviously paradoxical character is explained when one takes into account the opposition between cause and causality. For Lacan, they are in no way the same, since a cause, in the strict sense of the term, is precisely something which intervenes at the point where the network of causality, the chain of causes and effects, falters, when there is a cut, a gap in the causal chain. In this sense, a cause is, for Lacan, by definition, a distant cause. An absent cause, as one used to put it in the jargon of the happy structuralist of the 1960s and 1970s. It acts in the interstices of the direct causal network. What Lacan has in mind here is specifically the working of the unconscious. Imagine an ordinary slip of the tongue. At a chemistry conference, someone gives a paper about, say, the exchange of fluids. All of a sudden, he stumbles and makes a slip, blurting out something about the passage of sperm in the sexual act. An attractor, from what Freud called an other scene, intervenes like a type of gravity, exerting its invisible influence from a distance, curving the space of the speech flow, introducing a gap into it. What makes this Lacanian thesis so interesting for the philosophical perspective is that it allows us to approach in a new way the old topic of causality and freedom. Freedom is opposed to causality, but not to the cause. The standard political trope, the cause of freedom, should be taken more literally than is usually intended, including both main meanings of the term cause, a cause which produces effects, and a political cause that mobilizes us. Perhaps the two meanings are not as disparate as they may appear. The cause that mobilizes us, the cause of freedom, acts as the absent cause which disturbs the network of causality. It is a cause which makes me free, extracting me from the network of causes and effects. And perhaps this is also how one should understand the infamous Marxist formula of the determination in the last instance. The overdetermining instance of economy is also a distant cause, never a direct one. That is, it intervenes in the gaps of direct social causality. With the class struggle, it is today a little bit like Freud's patient's answer to the question as to the identity of the woman in his dream. Whatever this fight is about, it is not class struggle, but sexism, cultural intolerance, religious fundamentalism. One of the standard topics of post-Marxism is that today the working class is no longer the predestined revolutionary subject. The contemporary emancipatory struggles are plural, with no particular agent who can claim to occupy a privileged place. The way to answer this reproach is to concede even more. There never was such a privilege of the working class. The key structural role of the working class does not imply this kind of priority. How then does the determining role of economy function, if it is not the ultimate referent of the social field? Imagine a political struggle fought in the terms of popular musical culture, as was the case in some post-socialist Eastern European countries, in which the tension, in the field of popular music, between pseudo-folk and rock, functioned as a displacement of the tension between the nationalist conservative right and the liberal left. To put it in old-fashioned terms, a popular cultural struggle expressed, provided the terms in which a political struggle was fought out, as in the US today, where country music is predominantly conservative and rock predominantly left-liberal. Following Freud, is it not enough to say that the struggle in popular music was here only a secondary expression, a symptom, an encoded translation of the political struggle, which was what the whole thing was really about. Both struggles have a substance of their own. The cultural struggle is not just a secondary phenomenon, a battlefield of shadows to be deciphered for its political connotation, which, as a rule, is obvious enough. The determining role of the economy does not mean that, in this case, what all the fuss really was about was the economic struggle, so that we should imagine the economy as a hidden meta-essence, which then expresses itself with a two-level distance in a cultural struggle. It determines politics, which in turn determines culture. On the contrary, the economy ascribes itself in the course of the very transposition of the political struggle into the popular cultural struggle, into how this transposition is never direct, but always displaced, asymmetrical. The class connotation, as it is encoded in cultural ways of life, can often turn around the explicit political connotation. Recall how, in the famous presidential TV debate in 1959 responsible for Nixon's defeat, it was the liberal Kennedy who was perceived as an upper-class patrician, while the rightist Nixon appeared as his opponent of more humble origins. This, of course, does not mean that the second opposition simply belies the first one, that it stands for the truth obfuscated by the first, namely that Kennedy, who in his public statements presented himself as Nixon's progressive liberal opponent, in fact signaled through his lifestyle, features enacted in the debate, that he was really simply an upper-class patrician. But it does mean that the displacement bears witness to the limitation of Kennedy's progressivism. That is, it does point towards the contradictory nature of Kennedy's ideologico-political position, and it is here that the determining instance of the economy enters. The economic is the absent cause that accounts for the displacement in representation, for the asymmetry, reversal in this case, between the two series, the couple progressive conservative politics and the couple upper middle class. The Lacloian solution would have been to conceive such contaminations as the enchainment of antagonisms into a contingent series of equivalences. The fact that the political opposition left-right contaminates the popular musical opposition of rock and country is a contingent result of the struggle for hegemony, namely that there is no inner necessity for rock to be progressive or for country to be conservative. There is, however, an asymmetry here that is obfuscated by this straightforward solution. The political struggle is not one among other struggles, in a series alongside artistic, economic, religious, etc. struggles. It is the purely formal principle of antagonistic struggle as such. That is to say, there is no proper content of politics. All political struggles and decisions concern other specific spheres of social life: taxation, the regulation of sexual mores and procreation, the health service, and so on and so forth. Politics is merely a formal mode of dealing with these topics, insofar as they emerge as topics of public struggle and decision. This is why everything is, or rather can become, political, insofar as it becomes a stake in political struggle. The economy, on the other hand, is not just one of the spheres of political struggle, but the cause of the mutual contamination and expression of struggles. To put it succinctly, left-right is the master signifier, contaminated by the series of other oppositions, while the economy is the objet A, the elusive object that sustains this contamination. And when that contamination is directly economic, the economy encounters itself in its oppositional determination. Politics is thus a name for the distance of the economy from itself. Its space is opened up by the gap that separates the economic, as the absent cause, from the economy in its oppositional determination, as one of the elements of the social totality. There is politics because the economy is non-all, because the economic is an impotent, impassive pseudo-cause. The economic is thus here doubly inscribed in the precise sense which defines the Lacanian real. It is simultaneously the hard core expressed in other struggles, through displacements and other forms of distortion, and the very structuring principle of these distortions. In its long and twisted history, Marxist social hermeneutics has relied on two logics which, although often confounded under the ambiguous shared term of the economic class struggle, are completely different. On the one hand, there is the infamous economic interpretation of history. All struggles, artistic, ideological, political, are ultimately conditioned by the economic class struggle, which is their secret meaning to be deciphered. On the other hand, everything is political. That is, the Marxist view of history is thoroughly politicized. There are no social, ideological, cultural, and other phenomena that are not contaminated by the basic political struggle. And this goes even for the economy. The illusion of trade unionism is precisely that the workers' struggle can be depoliticized, reduced to a purely economic negotiation for better work conditions, and so on. However, these two contaminations, the economic determines everything in last instance, everything is political, do not obey the same logic. The economy, without the extimate political core, class struggle, would be a positive social matrix of development, as it is in the pseudo-Marxist, evolutionary historicist notion of development, to which Marx himself came dangerously close in his preface to the critique of political economy. In the social production of their existence, men inevitably enter into definite relations, which are independent of their will, namely relations of production appropriate to a given stage in the development of their material forces of production. The totality of these relations of production constitutes the economic structure of society, the real foundation, on which arises a legal and political superstructure, and to which correspond definite forms of social consciousness. The mode of production of material life conditions the general process of social, political, and intellectual life. It is not the consciousness of men that determines their existence, but their social existence that determines their consciousness. At a certain stage of development, the material productive forces of society come into conflict with the existing relations of production, or, this merely expresses the same thing in legal terms, with the property relations within the framework of which they have operated hitherto. From forms of development of the productive forces, these relations turn into their fetters. Then begins an era of social revolution. The changes in the economic foundation lead, sooner or later, to the transformation of the whole immense superstructure. In studying such transformations, it is always necessary to distinguish between the material transformation of the economic conditions of production, which can be determined with the precision of natural science, and the legal, political, religious, artistic, or philosophic, in short, ideological forms, in which men become conscious of this conflict and fight it out. Just as one does not judge an individual by what he thinks about himself, so one cannot judge such a period of transformation by its consciousness. But, on the contrary, this consciousness must be explained from the contradictions of material life, from the conflict existing between the social forces of production and the relations of production. No social order is ever destroyed before all the productive forces for which it is sufficient have been developed, and new superior relations of productions never replace older ones before the material conditions for their existence have matured within the framework of the old society. The evolutionist logic of these lines is clear. The motor of social progress is the apolitical development of the forces and means of production. They determine the relations of production, and so on. On the other hand, pure politics, decontaminated from the economy, is no less ideological. Vulgar economism and ideologico-political idealism are two sides of the same coin. The structure is here that of an inward loop. The class struggle is politics in the very heart of the economic. Or, to put it paradoxically, one can reduce all political, juridical, cultural content to the economic base, deciphering it as its expression, all except class struggle, which is the political in the economic itself. Mutatis mutandis, the same holds for psychoanalysis. All dreams have sexual content, except explicitly sexual dreams. Why? Because the sexualization of a context is formal, the principle of its distortion. through repetition, the oblique approach, and so on. Every topic, inclusive of sexuality itself, is sexualized. The ultimate properly Freudian lesson is that the explosion of human symbolic capacities does not merely expand the metaphoric scope of sexuality. Activities that are in themselves thoroughly asexual can become sexualized. Everything can be eroticized and start to mean that. But much more importantly, this explosion sexualizes sexuality itself. The specific quality of human sexuality has nothing to do with the immediate, rather stupid, reality of copulation, including the preparatory mating rituals. It is only when animal coupling gets caught in the self-referential vicious cycle of the drive, in the protracted repetition of its failure to reach the impossible thing, that we have what we call sexuality. That is, that sexuality itself becomes sexualized. In other words, the fact that sexuality can spill over and function as a metaphoric content of every other human activity is not a sign of its power, but on the contrary a sign of its impotence, failure, its inherent blockage. The class struggle is thus a unique mediating term which, while mooring politics in the economy, all politics is ultimately an expression of class struggle, simultaneously stands for the irreducible political moment in the very heart of the economic. Drawing the line. The consequences of these conceptual elaborations for the dilemma of the direct expression of the universal or its constitutive distortion are clear. Leclau's basic political argument against me is that, due to my rigid, class-reductionist, pseudo-revolutionary vision, I am condemned to waiting for the Martians. Since the conditions I set for revolutionary agents are specified within such a rigid geometry of social effects that no empirical actor can fit the bill. However, in order to sustain the appearance that I am talking about real agents, I have to have recourse to the process of Martianization, to attribute to actually existing subjects the most absurd features while keeping their names so that the illusion of a contact with reality is maintained. One cannot but take note of how close this process, mockingly described by Leclau as Martianization, resembles his own theory of hegemony. An empirical event is elevated to the dignity of the thing. It starts to function as the embodiment of the impossible fullness of society. Referring to Joan Kopiec, Leclau compares hegemony to the breast value attached to partial objects. So, mutatis mutandis, is his thesis not that, since Martians are impossible, but necessary, in the process of hegemony, an empirical social element is invested with Martian value? The difference between me and him being that I am supposed to believe in real Martians, while he knows that the place of Martians is forever empty, so that all we can do is invest empirical agents with Martian value. It is Leclau who is here, like Kant, all too naive in his critical stance, namely in his assertion of the irreducible gap between empty universality and its distorted representation. From my Hegelian standpoint, this gap can be overcome. How? Not through the arrival of an adequate direct presentation of the universal, but so that distortion as such is asserted as the site of universality. Universality appears as the distortion of the particular, in an exact homology with Freud's logic of dreams, where the universal unconscious desire, which, to put it in Marxist terms, determines the dream in the last instance, is not the core of the dream expressed in the dream's text in a displaced, distorted form, but the process of the distortion itself. In this precise sense, it is wrong to say that the central social antagonism, class struggle, is always expressed, articulated in a distorted, displaced way. It is the very principle of this distortion. Consequently, true class politics has nothing whatsoever to do with focusing exclusively on class struggle and reducing all particular struggles to secondary expressions and effects of the one and only true struggle. Let us return to Mao's On Contradiction. His main claim there is that, in each concrete situation, A different particular contradiction is the predominant one, in the precise sense that, in order to win the battle for the resolution of the principal contradiction, one should treat a particular contradiction as the predominant one, to which all other struggles should be subordinated. But the question remains, why does the economic occupy this structuring role? Again, a homology with psychoanalysis could help us to clarify matters, since one can, and often does, raise exactly the same objection against Freud. Why is it unconscious desire which overdetermines the entanglement of all other dream wishes of sexual nature? Why should we not assert open interaction, in which the predominant role of a specific wish is itself the result of a struggle for hegemony between different wishes? Is the central role of sexuality not a clear reminder of Freud's sexual essentialism in an exact parallel to Marx's economic essentialism? The answer is simple for a true Freudian. Sexuality spills over all other contents. Every content can be sexualized because of sexuality's inherent failure. There is no sexual relationship. That is to say, the central event in the becoming human of humanoids was symbolic castration, the imposition of the bar of impossibility, which extracted sexuality from the domain of instinctual satisfactions regulated by seasonal rhythms, transforming it into a metaphysical, infinite search for the impossible thing. The Freudian hypothesis is thus that sexuality is not just one among the possible innuendos, connotations, of every speech. It is, much more strongly, inherent to the form of connotation as such. The very fact that something means much more than it seems sexualizes it. That is, symbolic castration sustains the very indeterminacy of the space in which connotations can float around. And the Marxist hypothesis is that, mutatis mutandis, the same goes for the economy, for the collective process of production. The social organization of production, the mode of production, is not just one among many levels of social organization. It is the site of contradiction, of structural instability, of the central social antagonism. There is no class relationship, which, as such, spills over into all other levels. Now we can also answer the reproach that commodity fetishism relies on the opposition between the direct expression of an idea, or a subject, and its distorted metaphoric representation. Let me explain this point by referring to the thesis that today we live in a post-ideological world. There are two ways to understand this thesis. Either we take it in a naive post-political sense, finally liberated from the burden of great ideological narratives and causes, we can dedicate ourselves to pragmatically solving real problems. Or in a more critical way, as a sign of the contemporary predominant form of cynicism, power no longer needs a consistent ideological structure to legitimize its rule. It can afford to directly state the obvious truth, the search for profits, the brutal imposition of economic interest. According to the second reading, there is no longer a need for the refined procedure of ideologie critique for a symptomal reading that detects the faults in an ideological edifice. Such a procedure knocks at an open door, since the thoroughly cynical power discourse concedes all this in advance, like the analysand of today who calmly accepts the analyst's suggestions about his innermost obscene desires, no longer shocked by anything else. Is this really the case? If it is, then ideologie critique and psychoanalysis are ultimately of no use, since the wager of their interpretive procedure is that the subject cannot openly admit and really assume the truth about what she is doing. However, psychoanalysis opens up a way to unmask this apparent proof of its uselessness by detecting, beneath the deceptive openness of post-ideological cynicism, the contours of fetishism, and thus opposing the fetishistic mode of ideology, which predominates in our allegedly post-ideological era, to its traditional symptomal mode, in which the ideological lie which structures our perception of reality is threatened by symptoms qua returns of the repressed, cracks in the fabric of the ideological lie. The fetish is effectively a kind of envers of the symptom. That is to say, the symptom is the exception which disturbs the surface of false appearance. the point at which the repressed other scene erupts, while the fetish is the embodiment of the lie, which enables us to sustain the unbearable truth. Let us take the case of the death of a beloved person. In the case of a symptom, I repress this death. I try not to think about it, but the repressed trauma returns in the symptom. In the case of a fetish, on the contrary, I rationally fully accept this death, and yet I cling to the fetish, to some feature that embodies for me the disavowal of this death. In this sense, a fetish can play a very constructive role by allowing us to cope with the harsh reality. Fetishists are not dreamers lost in their private worlds. They are thoroughly realist, able to accept the way things effectively are, since they have their fetish to which they can cling in order to cancel the full impact of reality. There is a wonderful early short story by Patricia Highsmith, Button, about a middle-class New Yorker who lives with his intellectually impaired 9-year-old son, who babbles meaningless sounds all the time, and smiles, with saliva drooling from his mouth. Late one evening, unable to endure the situation any longer, the main character decides to take a walk in the lonely Manhattan streets, where he stumbles upon a destitute homeless beggar who pleadingly extends his hand towards him. In an act of inexplicable fury, the hero beats the beggar to death and tears a button from his jacket. Afterwards, he returns home a changed man, enduring his family nightmare serenely, capable of even a kind smile for his handicapped son. He keeps this button all the time in the pocket of his trousers, a perfect fetish, the embodied disavowal of his miserable reality, the constant reminder that, at least once, he had been able to strike back against his miserable destiny. In Stasi-land, Anna Funder describes an even crazier case of the fetish, which occurred in the real life of Hagen Koch, the GDR Stasi officer who attracted the attention of the world's media on August 13, 1961, when the GDR authorities started to build the Berlin Wall. His dubious honor was as the man who literally drew the line of the wall, a worker in the map department of the Stasi. He was ordered to mark with white paint the exact line that separates East from West Berlin, so that the wall could then be constructed at the appropriate place. For a whole day, he was seen and photographed, walking slowly with one foot in the east and the other in the west, and drawing the line. It is as if this in-between position somehow symbolized his basic attitude towards political reality. He was leading a life full of compromises and hesitations, oscillating between fidelity to the GDR regime and acts of small rebellion. Among other things, he married a girl from a non-communist family, in spite of the opposition of his Stasi superiors. Finally, he got sick and tired of his Stasi job, asked for a transfer, and was allowed to move to a post in the regular army. At this precise point in his life, he committed something of an act. When emptying his office in the Stasi building, he noticed for the first time a cheap, kitsch, gold-painted plastic plate hanging on the wall by his desk, a ridiculous official recognition of the honorable third place his unit had won in the Stasi ranking for work in culture. He smuggled this plate out beneath his coat as his act of small private revenge for all the compromises and humiliations of his life. Stealing this plate was the only thing for which he could summon enough courage. He drew the line here, this time, literally, and he held it because, to his surprise, and as befits the German bureaucracy, there were reactions to and consequences of his act, more numerous and stronger than he had expected. First, 3 weeks later, 2 Stasi superior officers visited him at home, accused him of stealing the plate, and demanded that he return it. He denied it, and upon request, signed a sworn statement that he had not taken it. Then, years later, after Die Wende, he improvised in his apartment a small private museum about the wall, where things were presented from the Eastern perspective. Since he was also known as the person who had drawn the line of the wall in 1961, this caused some interest, and in 1993, he was interviewed in his flat on TV, with the stolen plate hanging on the wall behind him. A technician asked him to remove the plate because it reflected the light and caused too much glitter. Koch furiously refused to do it. "I'll do anything for you, but the plate will stay where it is." The plate stayed there. However, a couple of days later, after the report on his museum was shown on TV, a Treuhand agent, Treuhand was the federal agency dealing with the fate of GDR state property, appeared at his door, again demanding the plate. According to the new law, GDR state property had now become the property of the United Federal Republic of Germany, and since he had stolen the plate, he now had to return it. Koch furiously threw the agent out. The agent left with threats of a court procedure. Weeks later, the agent again visited him, informing him that the charges of the theft of state property against him had been dropped. The stolen object was of minimal value, and his crime had taken place years earlier, so that the deadline for judicial action had passed long ago. However, the agent informed him there was now a new charge raised against him, the charge of false testimony to the Stasi, since decades ago he had signed the statement that he had not stolen the plate. And this false sworn statement still was a punishable crime. Koch threw the agent out again, but his troubles continued. Because of rumors that he was a thief, his career suffered, and his wife even lost her job. As Koch put it to Anna Funder, "All the courage I had is in that plate. The whole shitty little skerrick of it. That's all I had. That plate stays there." This is a fetish at its purest, a tiny, stupid object to which I cling and which allows me to endure all the dirty compromises of my life. Do we not all have, in one or another form, such fetishes? They can be our inner spiritual experiences, which tell us that our social reality is mere appearance, which does not really matter. Our children, for whose good we do all the humiliating things in our jobs, and so on and so forth. Let us turn to the standard reproach that commodity fetishism relies on the opposition between direct expression of an idea, or a subject, and its distorted metaphoric representation. This reproach only holds if one sticks to the simplistic notion of the fetish as an illusion, obfuscating the true state of things. In psychiatric circles, there is a story told about a man whose wife was diagnosed with acute breast cancer and who died 3 months later. The husband survived her death unscathed, being able to talk coolly about his traumatic last moments with her. How? Was he a cold, distant, and unfeeling monster? Soon his friends noticed that, while talking about his deceased wife, he always held a hamster in his hands, her pet object, and now his fetish, the embodied disavowal of her death. No wonder that when a couple of months later the hamster died, the man broke down and had to be hospitalized for a long period, treated for acute depression. So, when we are bombarded by claims that in our post-ideological, cynical era, nobody believes in the proclaimed ideals, when we encounter a person who claims he has been cured of any beliefs, accepting social reality the way it really is, one should always counter such claims with the question, okay, but where is your hamster, the fetish which enables you to pretend to accept reality the way it is? And does exactly the same not hold true for the Marxian concept of commodity fetishism? Here is the very beginning of the famous subdivision 4 of the first chapter of Capital, on fetishism of the commodity and its secret. A commodity appears at first sight an extremely obvious, trivial thing, but its analysis brings out that it is a very strange thing, abounding in metaphysical subtleties and theological niceties. These lines should surprise us, since they invert the standard procedure for demystifying a theological myth, that of reducing it to its terrestrial base. Marx does not claim, in the usual manner of Enlightenment critique, that critical analysis should demonstrate how what appears a mysterious theological entity emerged out of ordinary real-life process. He claims, on the contrary, that the task of critical analysis is to unearth the metaphysical subtleties and theological niceties in what appears at first sight just an ordinary object. In other words, when a critical Marxist encounters a bourgeois subject immersed in commodity fetishism, The Marxist's reproach to him is not, the commodity may seem to you to be a magical object endowed with special powers, but it really is just a reified expression of relations between people. The Marxist's reproach is, rather, you may think that the commodity appears to you as a simple embodiment of social relations. That, for example, money is just a kind of voucher entitling you to a part of the social product. But this is not how things really seem to you. In your social reality, by means of your participation in social exchange, you bear witness to the uncanny fact that a commodity really appears to you as a magical object, endowed with special powers. It is in this precise sense that the contemporary era is perhaps less atheistic than any one prior. We are all ready to indulge in utter skepticism, cynical distance, exploitation of others, without any illusions, violations of all ethical constraints, extreme sexual practices, and so on and so forth, protected by the silent awareness that the big other is ignorant about it. Niels Bohr provided the perfect example of how this fetishistic disavowal of belief works in ideology. Seeing a horseshoe hanging above the entrance to Bohr's country house, a surprised visitor said that he did not believe in the superstition that the horseshoe keeps the bad spirits out of the house and brings luck. To which Bohr snapped back, "Nor do I believe in it. I have it there because I was told that it also works if one does not believe in it." Fetishism does not operate at the level of mystification and distorted knowledge. What is really displaced in the fetish, transferred onto it, is not knowledge but illusion itself, the belief threatened by knowledge. Far from obfuscating realistic knowledge of how things are, the fetish is, on the contrary, the means that enables the subject to accept this knowledge without paying the full price for it. I know very well how things really stand, and I am able to endure this bitter truth because of a fetish, a hamster, a button, in which the illusion to which I stick is embodied. Although at a purely formal level, the fetish also involves a gesture of transference onto the fetish object. It functions as an exact inversion of the standard formula of transference, with the subject supposed to know. What the fetish gives body to is precisely my disavowal of knowledge, my refusal to subjectively assume what I know. Therein, to emphasize a point I made earlier, resides the contrast between the fetish and the symptom. A symptom embodies a repressed knowledge, the truth about the subject that the subject is not ready to assume. In a certain kind of Christianity, Christ himself is elevated into a fetish, insofar as he is supposed to be the innocent subject who ignores the wicked ways of the world. This dialectic of fetishism reaches its apogee in today's virtual capitalism. Capitalism as such entails the radical secularization of social life. It mercilessly tears apart all aura of authentic nobility, sacredness, honor, etc. It has drowned the most heavenly ecstasies of religious fervor, of chivalrous enthusiasm, of Philistine sentimentalism, in the icy water of egotistical calculation. It has resolved personal worth into exchange value, and in place of the numberless, indefeasible chartered freedoms, has set up that single unconscionable freedom, free trade, in one word, for exploitation. Veiled by religious and political illusions, it has substituted naked, shameless, direct, brutal exploitation. However, the fundamental lesson of the critique of political economy, elaborated by the mature Marx in the years after the Manifesto, is that this reduction of all heavenly chimerae to the brutal economic reality generates a spectrality of its own. When Marx describes the mad, self-enhancing circulation of capital, whose solipsistic path of self-fecundation reaches its apogee in today's meta-reflexive speculation on futures, it is far too simplistic to claim that the spectre of this self-engendering monster that pursues its path, disregarding any human or environmental concern, is an ideological abstraction, and that one should never forget that behind this abstraction there are real people and natural objects on whose productive capacities and resources capital's circulation is based, and on which it feeds itself like a gigantic parasite. The problem is that this abstraction is not only in our, the financial speculators' misperception of social reality, but that it is real in the precise sense of determining the structure of the very material social processes. The fate of whole strata of population, and sometimes of whole countries, can be decided by the solipsistic speculative dance of capital, which pursues its goal of profitability in blessed indifference as to how its movement will affect social reality. Today, is this not more true than ever? Do phenomena usually designated as virtual capitalism, futures trading, and similar abstract financial speculations not point towards the reign of the real abstraction at its purest, much more radically than in Marx's time? In short, the highest form of ideology does not reside in getting caught up in the ideological spectrality, forgetting about its foundation in real people and their relations, but precisely in overlooking this real spectrality and in pretending to address directly real people with their real worries. Visitors to the London Stock Exchange get a free leaflet, which explains to them that the stock market is not about some mysterious fluctuations, but about real people and their products. This is ideology at its purest. The standard Marxist topic of reification and commodity fetishism still relies on the notion of the fetish as a solid object whose stable presence obfuscates its social mediation. Paradoxically, fetishism reaches its acme precisely when the fetish itself is dematerialized, turned into a fluid, immaterial, virtual entity. Money fetishism will culminate with the passage to its electronic form, when the last traces of its materiality will disappear. Electronic money is the third form, after real money, which directly embodies its value, gold, silver, and paper money, which, although a mere sign with no intrinsic value, still clings to its material existence. And it is only at this stage, when money becomes a purely virtual point of reference, that it finally assumes the form of an indestructible spectral presence. I owe you $1,000, and no matter how many material notes I burn, I still owe you $1,000. The debt is inscribed somewhere in the virtual digital space. It is only with this thoroughgoing dematerialization, when Marx's claim from the manifesto that, under capitalism, all that is solid melts into air, acquires a much more literal meaning than the one Marx had in mind. It is only at this point that what Derrida called the spectral aspect of capitalism is fully actualized. One should thus reject the enthusiastic claims regarding our entry into a new era of virtual capitalism. What this new era makes visible is a virtual dimension which was here all the time. Recall Kant's rejection of the ontological proof of God's existence, which takes as its starting point his thesis that being is not a predicate. If one knows all predicates of an entity, its being, existence, does not follow. That is, one cannot conclude being from a notion. The departure from Leibniz is clear here, according to whom two objects are indiscernible if all of their predicates are the same. The implication for the ontological proof of God is clear, in the same way that I can have a perfect notion of 100 thalers and still do not have them in my pocket. I can have a perfect notion of God, and God still does not exist. The irony is that Kant talks about thalers, money, whose existence as money is not objective, but depends on notional determinations. True, as Kant says, having a concept of 100 thalers is not the same as having them in your pocket, but let us imagine a process of rapid inflation which totally devalues the thalers. Yes, they are still there in my pocket, but they are no longer money, just meaningless, valueless coins. In other words, money is precisely an object whose status depends on how we think about it. If people no longer treat this piece of metal as money, if they no longer believe in it as money, it no longer is money. The lesson of these paradoxes is the odd overlapping of cynicism and belief. While capitalism is resolutely materialistic, what ultimately matters is wealth, real power, pleasures. All other things are just noble lies, chimerae covering up this hard truth. This cynical wisdom itself has to rely on a vast network of belief. The whole capitalist system functions only insofar as one plays the game and believes in money. takes it seriously and practices a fundamental trust in others who are also supposed to participate in the game. Capital markets, now valued at an estimated $83 trillion, exist within a system based purely on self-interest, in which herd behavior, often based on rumors, can inflate or destroy the value of companies, or whole economies, in a matter of hours. It is in this very imbrication of brutal cynicism with wide-eyed belief that the objective irony of capitalism resides. One can thus imagine, as a counterpoint to this virtual capitalism in which real things take place at a purely virtual level of financial transfers, totally disconnected from our ordinary reality, a purely virtual collapse, the collapse of virtual markets as an end of the world, in which nothing in our material reality would really change. It is just that all of a sudden, people would refuse to give their trust. They would refuse to participate in the game. That is to say, the virtual status of money means that it functions like a nation. While the nation is the people's substance, the cause for which they are sometimes ready to sacrifice everything, it has no substantial reality of its own. It exists only insofar as people believe that it exists. It is a cause posited retroactively by its own effects. One should then imagine a scenario similar to the one envisaged by Saramago in his Seeing, in which a people all of a sudden refuses to participate in voting, only transposed to the economic domain, people refusing to participate in the financial virtual game. Perhaps such a refusal would be today the ultimate political act. In Murder in the Mews, an early Agatha Christie story, Hercule Poirot investigates the death of Mrs. Allen, found shot in her apartment on Guy Fawkes night. Although her death looks like suicide, numerous details indicate that a murder is more likely, and that a clumsy attempt has been made to make it look like Mrs. Allen took her own life. She shared a flat with Mrs. Plenderleith, who was away at the time. Soon a cufflink is found at the murder scene, and its owner, Major Eustace, is implicated in the crime. Poirot's solution is one of the best in Christie's work. It inverts the standard plot of a murder made to look like a suicide. The victim, who years ago had been caught up in a scandal in India, where she had also met Eustace, was engaged to marry a Conservative MP. Knowing that the public exposure of her scandal would ruin her chances of marriage, Eustace had been blackmailing her. In despair, Mrs. Allen shot herself. Coming home immediately after the suicide, Miss Plenderleith, who knew about Eustace's blackmail and hated him, quickly rearranged details at the scene of the death to make it look as though the murderer had tried clumsily to present the death as suicide, so that Eustace would be fully punished for driving Mrs. Allen to kill herself. The story thus turns the question on its head. How should the inconsistencies noted on the scene of crime be read? The story works because, instead of the murder being covered up, the usual narrative, its appearance is staged. That is, a crime is not concealed, but fabricated as a lure. Is this not what the instigators of populist violence do? In order to redirect the wrath of the deceived crowd, they misconstrue suicide as crime. In other words, they falsify the clues so that a catastrophe, which is a suicide, the result of imminent antagonisms, appears as the work of a criminal agent. This is why, to put it in Nietzschean terms, which are here fully appropriate, the ultimate difference between true radical emancipatory politics and populist politics is that authentic radical politics is active, imposing, enforcing its vision, while populism is fundamentally reactive, a reaction to a disturbing intruder. In other words, populism remains a version of the politics of fear. It mobilizes the crowd by way of invoking the fear of the corrupt intruder. The act. Is, however, this critique of Laclau really Lacanian? Yanis Stavrakakis' The Lacanian Left, an attempt to supplement Laclau's and Mouffe's project of radical democracy with Lacanian theory, disputes it. According to Stavrakakis, I started off well, but then in my work I move continuously into more bizarre and unfathomable directions. The key reproach concerns my alleged idealization of Antigone, of the radical autonomy of her suicidal pure desire. Such a stance excludes her from the socio-political field. I claim that the subject of an act risks an encounter with death and momentarily suspends the symbolic legal framework. But Antigone clearly does not meet these criteria. She not only risks death, she desires it. Risk entails a minimum of strategic or pragmatic calculation, which is something alien to Antigone's pure desire. Suspension presupposes a before and an after, but for Antigone there is no after. In that sense, this was never a case of an act effecting a displacement of the status quo. Her act is a one-off, and she couldn't care less about what will happen in the polis after her suicide. Really? Far from just throwing herself into the arms of death, Sophocles' Antigone insists up to her death on performing a precise symbolic gesture, the proper burial of her brother. Like Hamlet, Antigone is a drama of a failed symbolic ritual. Lacan insisted on this continuity. He analyzed Hamlet in his seminar that precedes The Ethics of Psychoanalysis. Antigone does not stand for some extra symbolic real, but for the pure signifier. Her purity is that of a signifier. This is why, although her act is suicidal, the stakes are symbolic, and her persistence till death has a cathartic effect not only on us, the public, but also on the Theban people themselves, embodied in the chorus. Stavrakakis' point here is that I elevate Antigone's radical suicidal act, which excludes her from the symbolic community, into the model for a political act, thereby ignoring not only that Lacan never conceived Antigone in this way, but also the later shifts in his position. To focus exclusively on Lacan's commentary of Antigone would amount to ignoring the radical shift in Lacan's own position following the ethics seminar. Clearly, Antigone is not Lacan's last, or most insightful, word on the question of ethics and agency. His position continued to develop in a direction that undermined his earlier focus on Antigone's pure desire. Anyone taking seriously the important shift in Lacan's position has to abandon Antigone as a model of the ethico-political act, something that Žižek fails to do. Stavrakakis sees a strange regression in my work. In my early books, I insisted on the lack in the other as Lacan's key insight, while in my more recent work, I criticized this notion as belonging to deconstructionism, thus handing over to the latter Lacan's most precious insight. My notion of the act involves a miraculous emergence of unconditional positivity which suspends lack. That is, I rely on a strict opposition between lack, denoting finitude and negativity, and divine miracle, denoting immortality and positivity. Assuming lack means assuming negativity and finitude, while I conceive the act as absolute positive eternal, external to the symbolic, or, as Pluth and Hohen's claim, quoted approvingly by Stavrakakis, by neglecting the importance of an act's involvement with the symbolic, Žižek seems to be saying that the real of an act happens without the symbolic. Seems is a crucial word here, and as we shall see, in Stavrakakis' book 2, it registers his own doubt about the accuracy of his own reading. Such an absolutization of the act, which extracts it from its socio-symbolic texture, also makes it impossible to distinguish between true and false acts or events, between events and their simulacra, a standard argument against Badiou, as if I have not spent pages explaining how one can distinguish an event from its simulacrum by way of analyzing how the event relates to the symptonal knot, the inscription of the lack in a situation. So, while Stavrakakis' general line of argumentation is that I steer away from Lacan under the influence of Badiou, the ultimate joke is, predictably, that even Badiou is more Lacanian than me. What I do not see, and that Badiou does, is that the true positivity of a real event depends on its inextricable relation to the void of the evental site, to a registering of negativity. No wonder that I criticize Badiou when he warns of the totalitarian danger of enforcing a truth on a situation, of ignoring the nameless, the excess of the multiplicity of reality which resists being subsumed under a truth procedure. This is what Stalinism did in imposing forced collectivization and a centralized planned economy. It enacted its voluntarism, which ignored the inertia of reality, and in a quite consistent way, since Stalinism did not admit this excess of the nameless. It had to interpret the resistance of reality to its projects as intentional counter-revolution. And as expected, for Stavrakakis, this also holds for my notion of the act as unconditional, insofar as it knows no limitation, for which Badiou allows when he warned against the excess of enforcement. It necessarily leads to a totalitarian assertion. The reason I find Badiou problematic here is that, for me, something is wrong with the very notion that one can excessively enforce a truth. One is almost tempted to apply here the logic of the joke quoted by Lacan. My fiancée is never late for an appointment, because the moment she is late, she is no longer my fiancée. A truth is never enforced, because the moment the fidelity to truth functions as an excessive enforcement, we are no longer dealing with a truth, with fidelity to a truth event. In the case of Stalinism, its problem was not simply that of enforcing the truth, ruthlessly imposing it onto the situation. The problem is rather that the truth which was enforced, the vision of a centralized planned economy, and so forth, was in itself not a truth, so that the resistance of reality against it was a sign of its own falsity. The story goes on in a predictable way. My notion of a momentary, miraculous act implies an act without after. That is, I ignore the effects of the act, its inscription into the situation, as if I have not written many pages developing how what matters is not the act itself, but the day after, the way an act rearticulates the situation. Furthermore, I am accused of privileging positivity, of obliterating negativity, but such an act without after, just a rupture, a cut, would have been precisely a pure, non-positivized negativity. So I ignore the positivization, institutionalization of lack. Žižek seems, to deny the very possibility of institutionalizing lack and division, of articulating a positive political order encircling, but not neutralizing, negativity and impossibility. As if the whole point of my reading of Hegel's political thought is not that the Hegelian state is a negativity institutionalized. As if my privileging of the Lenin of 1919 to 22 over the Lenin of 1917 is not precisely the privileging of the Lenin of the institutionalization of a new order, which positivizes revolutionary negativity. Furthermore, because I ignore negativity, I do not see how the negative gesture of creating empty space is a condition of a positive act. Paul Klee once said, speaking of Mondrian, to create emptiness is the principal act, and this is true creation because this emptiness is positive. In politics, this is the radical democratic strategy, and this is what Žižek seems, unable to understand. As if I have not written pages and pages on opening up empty space, on reaching the point at which rien n'aura au lieu que le lieu, say, apropos of the relation between the death drive and sublimation, the negativity of the death drive as the condition of positive sublimation. How then does Stavrakakis react to the massive evidence that I have amply developed all the points he reproaches me for ignoring? Lack in the other, negativity, symbolic determination of the act. Instead of questioning his own reading of my notion of the act, he proclaims me a pervert, in theory. I have no intention to teach Žižek Lacanian commonplaces. I take it for granted that he knows them very well, better than I do. But this is exactly why it causes me great concern when Žižek himself seems to forget or abandon them. It is not by coincidence that I have used the psychoanalytic term disavowal to describe this attitude. As is well known, disavowal, as the fundamental operation of perversion, involves the simultaneous recognition and denial of something, in the clinic, of castration. In fact, Žižek's response seems, to come under this description. The sleight of hand is here truly breathtaking. Every counter-argument of mine is in advance devalued. I am accused of claiming A. I cite proof that I am not claiming A. And the answer is that I merely disavow my sticking to A. That my reasoning is, I know very well that A does not hold, but nonetheless I continue to act as if A holds. So when, at the end of the chapter dedicated to my work, Stavrakakis writes, why does Žižek bypass the whole Lacanian theorization of another, feminine, jouissance. There is no point defending myself by referring to dozens of pages in which I deal precisely with jouissance féminine. Such defense would be in advance devalued as a perverse recital of absurdity. The only pervert here is Stavrakakis himself. What if his underlying logic is, I know very well that my reproaches to Žižek are meaningless, but I continue to stick to them? What if, however, Stavrakakis is simply right in his claims about my notion of the act? On what evidence are these claims based? Here is a passage in which he allegedly demonstrates how my work displays the mechanism of disavowal in its unmistakable purity. Consider the following two quotations. First, Žižek argues that, in a situation like today's, the only way really to remain open to a revolutionary opportunity is to renounce facile calls to direct action. The only way to lay the foundations for a true radical change is to withdraw from the compulsion to act, to do nothing, thus opening up the space for a different kind of activity. 3 pages later, he condemns the resistance to political acts and the obsession with radical evil. It is as if the supreme good today is that nothing should happen. What is one supposed to conclude from this? Surely to do nothing does not make sense as a remedy against those who supposedly argue that nothing should happen. What one really concludes from this passage is that it exemplifies misreading in its unmistakable purity. The appearance of contradiction vanishes the moment we take into account the rather obvious fact that I am systematically opposing true activity, fidelity to the act proper, and false activity, which merely reproduces the existing constellation. Plus ça change, plus ça reste le même. We are active all the time to make sure that nothing will change. The condition for true change, a true act, is to stop false activity, or, as Badiou puts it in a sentence I quote repeatedly, it is better to do nothing than to contribute to the invention of formal ways of rendering visible that which empire already recognizes as existent. Another case. After quoting passages in which I assert contingency, every act is embedded in a contingent historical situation, and passages in which I assert the unconditional character of the act, Stavrakakis asks, how can an awareness of contingency be a necessary condition for something which actually presupposes that we abandon it and is located beyond any conditionality? The unconditional revolutionary act? Unfortunately for me, as a Hegelian, there is no contradiction here. What I refer to as the unconditional act is not the nonsense imputed to me, an act outside history, outside the symbolic, but simply the act irreducible to its conditions. Such an act is not only rooted in its contingent conditions, these very conditions make it into an act. The same gesture, performed at a wrong moment, too early or too late, is no longer an act. The properly dialectical paradox here is that what makes an act unconditional is its very contingency. If the act were necessary, this would mean that it is fully determined by its conditions, that it can be deduced from them, as the optimal version arrived at through strategic reasoning or rational choice theory. There is no need even to mention Hegel here. Derrida and Laclau suffice. In his reading of Kierkegaard, Derrida spoke about the madness of the act of choice, decision. The link between the situation and the act is thus clear, far from being determined by the situation, or from intervening in it from a mysterious outside. Acts are possible on account of the ontological non-closure, inconsistency, gaps in a situation. Further proof of my practice of fetishistic disavowal is the alleged perverse paradox of my rejection of utopias, while nonetheless claiming that today it is more important than ever to hold this utopian place of the global alternative open, as if I have not repeatedly elaborated different meanings of utopia. Utopia as simple imaginary impossibility, the utopia of a perfected harmonious social order without antagonisms, the consumerist utopia of contemporary capitalism, and utopia in the more radical sense of enacting what, within the framework of the existing social relations, appears as impossible. This second utopia is atopic, only with regard to these relations. And so on. All Stavrakakis' proofs rely on such misreadings. Commenting on my claim that, in Lacan's later versions of the act, this moment of madness beyond strategic intervention remains, he writes, is this idea of the supposedly unconditional real act, of an act unbound by any relation to the symbolic field, what defines Lacan's notion of the act? Note the breathtakingly false paraphrase from the claim that all authentic acts contain a moment of madness beyond strategic intervention, a claim found also in Derrida or Laclau. He jumps to an act bounded by any relation to the symbolic field. With such paraphrases, anything can be proven. Since Stavrakakis also accuses me of totally ignoring the history of Marxism, let me recall Karl Kautsky's defense of multi-party democracy. Kautsky conceived the victory of socialism as the parliamentary victory of the Social Democratic Party, and even suggested that the appropriate political form of the passage from capitalism to socialism would be the parliamentary coalition of progressive bourgeois parties and socialist parties. One is tempted to push this logic to the brink and suggest that, for Kautsky, the only acceptable revolution would be one that took place after a referendum, in which at least 51% of voters approved it. In his writings of 1917, Lenin saved his utmost acerbic irony for those who engage in the endless search for some kind of guarantee for the revolution. This guarantee assumes two main forms: either the reified notion of social necessity, one should not risk the revolution too early, one has to wait for the right moment, when the situation is mature with regard to the laws of historical development. It is too early for the socialist revolution. The working class is not yet mature. Or normative, democratic, legitimacy. The majority of the population is not on our side, so the revolution would not really be democratic. As Lenin repeatedly puts it, in other words, it is as if, before the revolutionary agent risks the seizure of state power, it should get permission from some figure of the big other, organize a referendum which will ascertain that the majority supports the revolution. With Lenin, as with Lacan, the point is that a revolution ne s'autorise que d'elle-même. One should accept the revolutionary act not covered by the big other. The fear of taking power prematurely, the search for the guarantee, is the fear of the abyss of the act. Democracy is thus not only the institutionalization of the lack in the other. Incidentally, the whole point of Hegel's theory of constitutional monarchy is that it is also exactly the same. By institutionalizing the lack, it neutralizes, normalizes it, so that the inexistence of the big other, Lacan's Il n'y a pas de grand autre, is again suspended. The big other is again here in the guise of the democratic legitimization, authorization of our acts. In a democracy, my acts are covered as legitimate acts which carry out the will of the majority. In contrast to this logic, the role of emancipatory forces is not to passively reflect the opinion of the majority, but to instigate the working classes to mobilize their forces, and thus to create a new majority. Or, as Trotsky put it in Terrorism and Communism, if the parliamentary regime, even in the period of peaceful, stable development, was a rather crude method of discovering the opinion of the country, and in the epoch of revolutionary storm completely lost its capacity to follow the course of the struggle and the development of revolutionary consciousness, the Soviet regime, which is more closely, straightly, honestly bound up with the toiling majority of the people, does achieve meaning, not in statically reflecting a majority, but in dynamically creating it. This last point relies on a crucial philosophical premise which renders deeply problematic the standard dialectical materialist theory of knowledge as reflection, propagated by Lenin himself in his Materialism and Empirio-criticism. Kautsky's worry that the Russian working class took power too early implies the positivist vision of history as an objective process which determines in advance the possible coordinates of political interventions. Within this horizon, it is unimaginable that a radical political intervention would change these very objective coordinates and thus, in a way, create the conditions for its own success. An act proper is not just a strategic intervention into a situation, bound by its conditions. It retroactively creates its own conditions. Recall Borges's precise formulation of the relationship between Kafka and the multitude of his precursors, from ancient Chinese authors to Robert Browning. Kafka's idiosyncrasy, in greater or less degree, is present in each of these writings. But if Kafka had not written, we would not perceive it. That is to say, it would not exist. Each writer creates his precursors. His work modifies our conception of the past, as it will modify the future. The properly dialectical solution of the dilemma of, is it really there in the source, or did we only read it into the source, is thus, it is there, but we can only perceive and state this retroactively, from today's perspective. This retroactivity was articulated by Deleuze. When Deleuze talks about genesis, of the actual out of the virtual, he does not mean temporal evolutionary genesis, the process of the spatio-temporal becoming of a thing, but a genesis without dynamism, evolving necessarily in the element of a suprahistoricity, a static genesis. This static character of the virtual field finds its most radical expression in Deleuze's notion of a pure past, a virtual past which already contains things still present. Present can become past because, in a way, it is already. It can perceive itself as part of the past. What we are doing now will have become history. It is with respect to the pure element of the past, understood as the past in general, as an a priori past, that a given former present is reproducible, and the present is able to reflect itself. Does this mean that this pure past involves a thoroughly deterministic notion of the universe in which everything to happen, to come, all actual spatio-temporal deployment, is already part of an immemorial atemporal virtual network? No, and for a very precise reason, because the pure past must be amenable to change through the occurrence of any new present. It was none other than T.S. Eliot who first clearly formulated the link between our dependence on tradition and our power to change the past. Tradition cannot be inherited, and if you want it, you must obtain it by great labor. It involves, in the first place, the historical sense, which we may call nearly indispensable to anyone who would continue to be a poet beyond his 25th year. And the historical sense involves a perception, not only of the pastness of the past, but of its presence. The historical sense compels a man to write, not merely with his own generation in his bones, but with the feeling that the whole of the literature of Europe from Homer, and within it the whole of the literature of his own country, has a simultaneous existence and composes a simultaneous order. What happens when a new work of art is created is something that happens simultaneously to all the works of art which preceded it. The existing monuments form an ideal order among themselves, which is modified by the introduction of the new, the really new, work of art among them. The existing order is complete before the new work arrives. For order to persist after the supervention of novelty, the whole existing order must be, if ever so slightly, altered. And so the relations, proportions, values of each work of art toward the whole are readjusted, and this is conformity between the old and the new. Whoever has approved this idea of order, of the form of European, of English literature, will not find it preposterous that the past should be altered by the present, as much as the present is directed by the past. When Eliot writes that, when judging a living poet, you must set him among the dead, he provides a precise example of Deleuze's pure past. When he writes that the existing order is complete before the new work arrives, for order to persist after the supervention of novelty, the whole existing order must be, if ever so slightly, altered. He no less clearly formulates the paradoxical link between the completeness of the past and our capacity to change it retroactively. Precisely because the pure past is complete, each new work rearranges its entire balance. Recall Borges's idea of how Kafka created his predecessors. Such retroactive causality, exerted by the effect itself upon its causes, is the minimal sine qua non of freedom. This is where Peter Hallward falls short in his otherwise excellent Out of This World, where he stresses only the aspect of the pure past as the virtual field in which the fate of all actual events is sealed in advance, since everything is already written in it. At this point, where we view reality sub specie aeternitatis, absolute freedom coincides with absolute necessity and its pure automatism. To be free means to let oneself freely flow in with the substantial necessity. But while Hallward is right to emphasize that, for Deleuze, freedom isn't a matter of human liberty, but of liberation from humanity, of fully submerging oneself in the creative flux of the absolute life, his political conclusion from this seems too facile. Since a free mode or monad is simply one that has eliminated its resistance to the sovereign will that works through it, so then it follows that the more absolute the sovereign's power, the more free are those subject to it. Hallwood ignores the retroactive movement on which Deleuze also insists, the way this eternal pure past which fully determines us is itself subjected to retroactive change. We are thus simultaneously less free and more free than we think. We are thoroughly passive, determined by and dependent on the past, but we have the freedom to define the scope of this determination, that is, to overdetermine the past which will determine us. Deleuze is here unexpectedly close to Kant, for whom I am determined by causes, but I can retroactively determine which causes will determine me. We, subjects, are passively affected by pathological objects and motivations, but, in a reflexive way, we ourselves have the minimal power to accept or reject being affected in this way. In other words, we retroactively determine the causes allowed to determine us, or at least the mode of this linear determination. Freedom is thus inherently retroactive. At its most elementary, it is not a free act which, out of nowhere, starts a new causal link, but a retroactive act of endorsing which link sequence of necessities will determine me. Here, one should add a Hegelian twist to Spinoza. Freedom is not simply recognized, known necessity, but recognized, assumed necessity, the necessity constituted, actualized, through this recognition. So, when Deleuze refers to Proust's description of Vinteuil's music that haunts Swann, as if the performers not so much played the little phrase as executed the rites necessary for it to appear, he is evoking the necessary illusion. Generating the sense event is experienced as a ritualistic evocation of a pre-existing event, as if the event was already there, waiting for our call in its virtual presence. What directly resonates in this topic is, of course, the Protestant trope of predestination. Far from being a reactionary theological trope, predestination is a key element of the materialist theory of sense, on condition that we read it along the lines of the Deleuzian opposition between the virtual and the actual. That is to say, predestination does not mean that our fate is sealed in an actual text, existing for eternity in the divine mind. The texture which predestines us belongs to the purely virtual eternal past, which, as such, can be retroactively rewritten by our act. This, perhaps, is the ultimate meaning of the singularity of Christ's incarnation. It is an act which radically changes our destiny. Prior to Christ, we were determined by fate, caught in the cycle of sin and its payment, while Christ's erasure of our past sins means precisely that his sacrifice changes our virtual past and thus sets us free. When Deleuze writes that my wound existed before me, I was born to embody it, does this variation on the theme of the Cheshire Cat and its smile from Alice in Wonderland, the cat was born to embody its smile, not provide a perfect formula of Christ's sacrifice? Christ was born to embody his wound, to be crucified. The problem is the literal teleological reading of this proposition, as if the actual deeds of a person merely actualize its atemporal, eternal fate, inscribed in its virtual idea. Caesar's only real task is to become worthy of the events he has been created to embody, amor fati. What Caesar actually does adds nothing to what he virtually is. When Caesar actually crosses the Rubicon, this involves no deliberation or choice, since it is simply part of the entire immediate expression of Caesarness. It simply unrolls or unfolds something that was encompassed for all times in the notion of Caesar. However, what about the retroactivity of a gesture which reconstitutes this past itself? This, perhaps, is the most succinct definition of what an authentic act is. In our ordinary activity, we effectively just follow the virtual phantasmatic coordinates of our identity, while an act proper is the paradox of an actual move which, retroactively, changes the very virtual, transcendental coordinates of its agent's being. Or, in Freudian terms, which not only changes the actuality of our world, but also rouses its infernal regions. We have thus a kind of reflexive folding back of the condition onto the given it was the condition for, while the pure past is the transcendental condition for our acts. Our acts not only create an actual new reality, they also retroactively change this very condition. In predestination, fate is substantialized into a decision that precedes the process, so that the stake of individuals' activities is not to performatively constitute their fate, but to discover or guess one's pre-existing fate. What is thereby obfuscated in the dialectical reversal of contingency into necessity, or the way the outcome of a contingent process is the appearance of necessity, things retroactively will have been necessary. This reversal was described by Jean-Pierre Dupuy. The catastrophic event is inscribed into the future as a destiny, for sure, but also as a contingent accident. It could not have taken place, even if, in futur antérieur, it appears as necessary. If an outstanding event takes place, a catastrophe, for example, it could not have taken place. Nonetheless, insofar as it did not take place, it is not inevitable. It is thus the event's actualization, the fact that it takes place, which retroactively creates its necessity. Dupuy takes as an example the French presidential elections in May 1995. Here is the January forecast of the main polling institute. If, on next May 8th, Mr. Balladur is elected, one can say that the presidential election was decided before it even took place. If, accidentally, an event takes place, it creates the preceding chain, which makes it appear inevitable. This, not the commonplaces regarding how the underlying necessity expresses itself in and through the accidental play of appearances, is, in Nietzsche, the Hegelian dialectic of contingency and necessity. The same goes for the October Revolution. Once the Bolsheviks won and stabilized their hold on power, their victory appeared as an outcome and expression of a deeper historical necessity. And even of Bush's much-contested first U.S. presidential victory, after the contingent and contested Florida majority, his victory retroactively appears as an expression of a deeper U.S. political trend. In this sense, although we are determined by destiny, we are nonetheless free to choose our destiny. This, according to Dupuy, is also how we should approach the ecological crisis, not to realistically appraise the possibilities of the catastrophe, but to accept it as destiny in the precise Hegelian sense. Like the election of Balladur, if the catastrophe happens, one can say that its occurrence was decided before it even took place. Destiny and free action, blocking the if, thus go hand in hand. Freedom is, at its most radical, the freedom to change one's destiny. The real. There is another curious point that should be mentioned here. Stavrakakis' reproach that I obliterate negativity. In my work, negativity magically disappears in the positivity of the act, is, as Stavrakakis himself notes, the exact opposite of Peter Hallwood's critique of my work. Hallwood's reproach concerns my alleged morbid fascination with negativity, the death drive, and so on, which misses the positivity of the event. Is this not strange? Two critical readings of the same work which attribute to me exactly opposite positions. Is the conclusion that imposes itself not that both of my critics merely use my theory as a kind of token to fill in a pre-established place in their matrix of wrong positions? Why then does Stavrakakis have to stick so stubbornly to the ridiculous notion of the act imputed to me? Obviously, it is not the case that the difference is only verbal, a mere misunderstanding. It is not that Stavrakakis and I claim the same thing, and that he has merely misread me. His perversion is conditioned by a weakness in his basic theoretical apparatus, a fault line which also prevents him from articulating a viable political project, so that all he offers is a new version of the old Freudo-Marxist platitudes. This basic weakness is discernible already in his brief methodological reflection in the introduction, where he draws attention to the circularity of positive sciences which claim that their theories fully reflect reality, and are proven by facts, thereby neglecting how the objective facts to which they refer are not the direct pre-symbolic real, but a real which is already mediated, constructed by the symbolic. Contrary to a popular unconditional Enlightenment optimism, knowledge in general is never adequate. Something always escapes. It looks as if theory is a straitjacket unable to contain our vibrant and unpredictable field of real experience. The underlying premise is here the identification of the couple knowledge experience with the couple symbolic real. One should assert the constitutive tension between knowledge and experience, symbolic and real. The Lacanian couple, symbolic real, is thus reduced to the common sense empiricist motif, theories are grey, while the tree of life is green. Our knowledge is always limited. It cannot ever fully encompass and account for the wealth of experience. Since, however, one cannot step out of knowledge and directly grasp the real, one should go on, pursuing the endless task of symbolizing the real, with the full awareness that every determinate symbolization is unstable, temporary, that it will be sooner or later destabilized through some traumatic encounter with the real. In the face of the irreducibility of the real of experience, we seem to have no other option but to symbolize, to keep on symbolizing, trying to enact a positive encircling of negativity. But this should not be a phantasmatic symbolization, attempting to mortify the real of experience. It will have to articulate a set of symbolic gestures, positivizations, that will include a recognition of the real limits of the symbolic, the real limits of theory, and attempts symbolically to institutionalize real lack, the negative trace of experience, or rather of our failure to neutralize experience. We thus end with what Hegel called spurious infinity. The subject strives to fill in the constitutive lack and provides an identity for itself through symbolic and imaginary identifications. However, no identification can produce a full identity. Lack always re-emerges. Stavrakakis is here not radical enough in pursuing his own premise. Every symbolic field needs a signifier of lack to suture itself. As Spinoza already recognized, in traditional religion, God is such a signifier. From the standpoint of true knowledge, God has no positive content. The signifier merely positivizes our ignorance. In short, although Stavrakakis endlessly varies the motif of how I do not take into account the possibility of lack itself being symbolized, positivized, institutionalized, he himself does not see it where it already operates.
There is nothing inherently subversive or progressive in the notion of the signifier of lack. Is the figure of the Jew in anti-Semitism not its supreme ideological example? This figure has no consistent positive content. What holds it together is the name Jew as the empty signifier. That is to say, the structure is here the same as that of the good old Polish anti-communist joke from the epoch of really existing socialism. Socialism is a synthesis of the greatest achievements of all previous modes of production. From pre-class tribal society, it takes primitivism. From the Asiatic mode of production, it takes despotism. From antiquity, it takes slavery. From feudalism, it takes the social domination of lords over serfs. From capitalism, it takes exploitation. And from socialism, it takes the name. The anti-Semitic figure of the Jew takes from great capitalists their wealth and social control, from the hedonists' sexual debauchery, from commercialized popular culture and the yellow press their vulgarity, from the lower classes their filth and bad smell, from intellectuals their corrupted sophistry, and from Jews their name. It is this intervention of the pure, empty signifier which engenders the mysterious X, the je ne sais quoi which makes Jews Jews. For a true anti-Semite, a Jew is not simply corrupt, promiscuous, and so on. He is corrupt, promiscuous, etc. because he is a Jew. In this sense, Jew is, within the anti-Semitic discourse, clearly a signifier of lack, the lack in the other. Consequently, Stavrakakis' equation of the real, with the experience of the excess of reality over its symbolization, has nothing to do with the Lacanian, or for that matter, Lacloian real. The Lacloian antagonism is not the positivity of the real outside the symbolic. It is totally inherent to the symbolic, its immanent crack or impossibility. The real is not the transcendent substantial reality which, from outside, disturbs the symbolic balance, but the immanent obstacle, stumbling block, of the symbolic order itself. This empiricist misreading of the Lacanian real accounts for Stavrakakis' strange use of negativity. The real as the excess of experience over its symbolization is negative only in the superficial sense that it undermines symbolization, since it functions as the otherness which resists it. In itself, however, this real is a positivity of the exuberant wealth of experience. For Lacan, things are exactly opposite. It is true that the early Lacan, in his first seminars, sometimes uses the real to designate pre-symbolic reality. However, this real is the pure positivity of being without any lack, as Lacan repeats again and again in these years. Rien ne manque dans le réel. Lack is introduced only by the symbolic. This is why, for Lacan, negativity is not the real undermining the symbolic from outside, but the symbolic itself. The process of symbolization, with its violent abstraction, reduction of the wealth of experience to the signifying trait unaire. Lacan quotes Hegel, "A word is the murder of the thing it designates, its mortification." For Lacan, the elementary form of negativity is thus not the excess of experience over its symbolization, but the very gap that separates symbolization from experienced reality. Recall the big photo of an elephant on the cover of the French edition of Lacan's first seminar. The elephant is here in its signifier, even if there is no real element roaming around. This brutal reduction of the real elephant to its signifier is negativity, or the death drive, at its purest. Although Lacan later shifts his position, the death drive is later defined as the symbolic system itself, which operates autonomously, ignoring reality. Finally, the death drive is conceived as the real which resists symbolization. The real remains immanent to the symbolic, its inherent traumatic core. There is no real without the symbolic. It is the emergence of the symbolic which introduces into reality the gap of the real. It is thus touching to find someone who can still think and write as if Hegel had not existed. And not only Hegel, what about Lacan's notion of the matheme, of the scientific real as the set of mathematized formulae opposed to imaginary experience? This is why Lacan strictly opposes scientific knowledge in the real to imaginary hermeneutic understanding. Furthermore, Stavrakakis' approach also misses the properly dialectical relationship between theory and practice in psychoanalysis. Freud's claim was that psychoanalysis would only be fully possible in a society which would no longer need it, so that psychoanalytic theory is not only the theory of what goes on in the analytic practice, the theory of the conditions of possibility of practice, but simultaneously the theory of its impossibility, of why practice is always open to failure, even doomed to fail. In this sense, it is not simply practice which is in excess over theory, it is theory which conceptualizes the limit of practice. It's real. Because he neglects this real, not merely symbolic, status of scientific knowledge, Stavrakakis identifies knowledge and understanding. In the same line of thought regarding the limitation of knowledge, he mentions Lacan's warning that one of the things you must guard most against is to understand too much. However, Lacan's point here is not, as Stavrakakis claims, that the registering of the limits of understanding allows for a better, or rather a different type of understanding. When Lacan talks about a kind of refusal of understanding, he opposes understanding and analytic knowledge. The aim of analysis is not to understand the patient, to provide the hidden meanings of his signifiers, but, on the contrary, to reduce meaning to the signifying non-sense, as he puts it in his Seminar 11. The key point here is that the Lacanian real, in its opposition to the symbolic, has nothing whatsoever to do with the standard empiricist, or phenomenological, or historicist, or Lebensphilosophie topic of the wealth of reality that cannot be reduced to abstract conceptual determinations. The Lacanian real is even more reductionist than any symbolic structure. We touch it when we subtract from a symbolic field all the wealth of its differences, reducing it to a minimum of antagonism. It is because of this minimalist, purely formal and insubstantial status of the real that, for Lacan, repetition precedes repression. Or, as Deleuze put it succinctly, we do not repeat because we repress because we repeat. It is not that first we repress some traumatic content, and then, since we are unable to remember it and thus to clarify our relationship to it, this content continues to haunt us, repeating itself in disguised forms. If the real is a minimal difference, then repetition that establishes this difference is primordial. The primacy of repression emerges with the reification of the real into a thing that resists symbolization. Only then does it appear that the excluded, repressed real insists and repeats itself. The real is primordially nothing but the gap that separates a thing from itself, the gap of repetition. The consequence of this is also the inversion of the relationship between repetition and re-memorialization. Freud's famous motto, "What we do not remember, we are compelled to repeat," should thus be turned upside down. What we are unable to repeat, we are haunted by and are compelled to remember. The way to get rid of a past trauma is not to remember it, but to fully repeat it, in the Kierkegaardian sense. What is Deleuzian pure difference at its purest, if we may put it in this tautological way? It is the purely virtual difference of an entity which repeats itself as totally identical with regard to its actual properties. There are significant differences in the virtual intensities expressed in our actual sensations. These differences do not correspond to actual recognizable differences. That the shade of pink has changed in an identifiable way is not all important. It is that the change is a sign of a rearrangement of an infinity of other actual and virtual relations. Is not such a pure difference what takes place in the repetition of the same actual melodic line in Robert Schumann's Humoresque? This piece is to be read against the background of the gradual loss of the voice in Schumann's songs. It is not a simple piano piece, but a song without the vocal line, with the vocal line reduced to silence, so that all we in fact hear is the piano accompaniment. This is how one should read the famous inner voice, innere Stimme, added by Schumann in the written score, as a third line between the two piano lines, higher and lower, as the vocal melodic line which remains a non-vocalized inner voice, which exists only as Augenmusik, music for the eyes only, in the guise of written notes. This absent melody is to be reconstructed on the basis of the fact that the first and third levels, the right and the left-hand piano lines, do not relate to each other directly. That is, their relationship is not that of an immediate mirroring. In order to account for their interconnection, one is thus compelled to reconstruct a third virtual intermediate level melodic line, which, for structural reasons, cannot be played. Schumann brings this procedure of absent melody to an apparently absurd self-reference when, later in the same fragment of Humoresque, he repeats the same two effectively played melodic lines. Yet this time the score contains no third absent melodic line, no inner voice. What is absent here is the absent melody, namely absence itself. How are we to play these notes when, at the level of what is in fact to be played, they exactly repeat the previous notes? The effectively played notes are deprived only of what is not there, of their constitutive lack. Or, to refer to the Bible, they lose even that which they never had. The true pianist should thus have the savoir-faire to play the existing positive notes in such a way that one would be able to discern the echo of the accompanying non-played silent virtual notes, or their absence. This, then, is pure difference, the nothing actual, the virtual background, which accounts for the difference of the two melodic lines. This logic of virtual difference can also be discerned in another paradox. The cinematic version of Edgar Doctorow's Billy Bathgate is basically a failure, but an interesting one. A failure which nonetheless evokes in the viewer the spectre of the much better novel. However, when one then goes on to read the novel on which the film is based, one is disappointed. This is not the novel the film evoked as the standard with regard to which it failed. The repetition of a failed novel in the failed film thus gives rise to a third, purely virtual element, the better novel. This is an exemplary case of what Deleuze deploys in the crucial pages of his Difference and Repetition. While it may seem that the two presents are successive, at a variable distance apart in the series of reals, in fact they form, rather, two real series which coexist in relation to a virtual object of another kind, one which constantly circulates and is displaced in them. Repetition is constituted not from one present to another, but between the two coexistent series that these presents form, in function of the virtual object. Object equals X. With regard to Billy Bathgate, the film does not repeat the novel on which it is based. Rather, they both repeat the unrepeatable virtual X, the true novel whose spectre is engendered in the passage from the actual novel to the film. The underlying movement is here more complex than it may appear. It is not that we should simply conceive the starting point, the novel, as an open work full of possibilities which can be deployed later, actualized in later versions, or even worse, that we should conceive the original work as a pretext which can later be incorporated in other contexts and given a meaning totally different from the original one. What is missing here is the retroactive backwards movement that was first described by Henri Bergson, a key reference for Deleuze. In his Two Sources of Morality and Religion, Bergson describes the strange sensation he experienced on August 4th, 1914, when war was declared between France and Germany. In spite of my turmoil, and although a war, even a victorious one, appeared to me as a catastrophe, I experienced what William James spoke about, a feeling of admiration for the facility of the passage from the abstract to the concrete. Who would have thought that such a formidable event can emerge in reality with so little fuss? Crucial is here the modality of the break between before and after. Before its outburst, the war appeared to Bergson simultaneously probable and impossible, a complex and contradictory notion which persisted to the end. After its outburst, it all of a sudden becomes real and possible, and the paradox resides in this retroactive appearance of probability. I never pretended that one can insert reality into the past and thus work backwards in time. However, one can without any doubt insert there the possible, or rather, at every moment the possible inserts itself there. Insofar as unpredictable and new reality creates itself, its image reflects itself behind itself in the indefinite past. This new reality finds itself all the time having been possible, but it is only at the precise moment of its actual emergence that it begins to always have been. And this is why I say that its possibility, which does not precede its reality, will have preceded it once this reality emerges. And this is what takes place in the example of Billy Bathgate. The film inserts back into the novel the possibility of a different, much better novel. And do we not encounter a similar logic in the relationship between Stalinism and Leninism? Here also 3 moments are in play. Lenin's politics before the Stalinist takeover, Stalinist politics, the spectre of Leninism retroactively generated by Stalinism in its official Stalinist version, but also in the version critical of Stalinism, as when, in the process of de-Stalinization in the USSR, the motto evoked was that of the return to original Leninist principles. One should therefore stop the ridiculous game of opposing the Stalinist terror to the authentic Leninist legacy betrayed by Stalinism. Leninism is a thoroughly Stalinist notion. The gesture of projecting the emancipatory utopian potential of Stalinism backwards into a preceding time signals the incapacity of the line of thought in enduring the absolute contradiction, the unbearable tension, inherent to the Stalinist project itself. It is therefore crucial to distinguish Leninism, as the authentic core of Stalinism, from the actual political practice and ideology of Lenin's period. The actual greatness of Lenin is not the same as the Stalinist authentic myth of Leninism. And the irony is that this logic of repetition, elaborated by Deleuze, the anti-Hegelian par excellence, is at the very core of the Hegelian dialectic. It relies on the properly dialectical relationship between temporal reality and the eternal absolute. The eternal absolute is the immobile point of reference around which temporal figurations circulate, their presupposition. However, precisely as such, it is posited by these temporal figurations, since it does not pre-exist them. It emerges in the gap between the first and the second. In the case of Billy Bathgate, between the novel and its repetition in the film. Or, back to humoresque, the eternal absolute is the third unplayed melodic line, the point of reference of the 2 lines played in reality. It is absolute but fragile. If the 2 positive lines are played wrongly, it disappears. This is what one is tempted to call materialist theology, the notion that temporal succession itself creates eternity.
The vacuity of the politics of jouissance. The short circuit between Stavrakakis' ontology and politics is not difficult to guess. The acceptance of the constitutive whole in the symbolic, the lack in the other, provides the space for theorizing democracy as the institutionalization of contingency. This brings us to the political wager of Stavrakakis' book. To combine an ethical attitude that reinvigorates modern democracy with a real passion for transformation, capable of stimulating the body politic without reoccupying the obsolete utopianism of the traditional left. Such a combination has to enact a delicate balancing act, avoiding both extremes of passionless egalitarian democracy a la Habermas and of passionate totalitarian engagement. The balance is between lack and excess. Lack is articulated in discourse theory, while excess points towards enjoyment as a political factor. For example, in recent debates about European identity, the neglect of the affective side of identification leads to a displacement of cathectic energy, which is now invested in anti-European political and ideological discourses. Modern society is defined by the lack of an ultimate transcendental guarantee, or, in libidinal terms, of total jouissance. There are three main ways to cope with this negativity: utopian, democratic, and post-democratic. The first, totalitarianism, fundamentalism, tries to reoccupy the ground of absolute jouissance by attaining a utopian and harmonious society, which eliminates negativity. The second, the democratic, enacts a political equivalent of traversing the fantasy. It institutionalizes the lack itself by creating the space for political antagonisms. The third, consumerist post-democracy, tries to neutralize negativity by transforming politics into apolitical administration. Individuals pursue their consumerist fantasies in the space regulated by expert social administration. Today, when democracy is gradually evolving into consumerist post-democracy, one should insist that the democratic potential is not exhausted. Democracy as an unfinished project could have been Stavrakakis' motto here. The key to the resuscitation of this democratic potential is to remobilize enjoyment. What is needed, in other words, is an enjoyable democratic ethics of the political. It is deeply symptomatic that Stavrakakis is silent about a key shift in Leclau's writings over the last few years. In his Populist Reason, Leclau clearly changed his position from radical democracy to populism, reducing democracy to the moment of democratic demand within the system. This shift has clear political grounds and implications. Suffice it to mention Leclau's support for Hugo Chavez. One can easily imagine a situation determined by a tension between the institutionalized democratic power bloc and the oppositional populist bloc, in which Leclau, and let me add to avoid a misunderstanding, here I would side with him, would opt for the populist bloc. When Stavrakakis criticizes my claim that a progressive military dictatorship can play a positive role, he is obviously not aware of my implicit reference to Leclau. But the key question here is, of course, what kind of enjoyment are we talking about? Libidinal investment and the mobilization of jouissance are the necessary prerequisite for any sustainable identification, from nationalism to consumerism. This also applies to the radical democratic ethics of the political, but the type of investment involved has still to be decided. Stavrakakis' solution is neither the phallic enjoyment of power nor the utopia of the incestuous full enjoyment, but a non-phallic, non-all, partial enjoyment. Predictably, I fit into this scheme as a representative of the incestuous utopia among the disillusioned leftists who, unable to mourn proletarian revolution and utopia, opt for a nostalgic return to the old, defeated and dangerous politics of reoccupation. Again, as if my Lenin book, Revolution at the Gates, is not precisely a book of mourning, not of melancholic attachment, but of parting with Lenin. Consequently, to repeat Lenin does not mean a return to Lenin. To repeat Lenin is to accept that Lenin is dead, that his particular solution failed, even failed monstrously, but that there was a utopian spark in it worth saving. To repeat Lenin means that one has to distinguish between what Lenin effectively did and the field of possibilities that he opened up, the tension in Lenin between what he effectively did and another dimension, what was in Lenin more than Lenin himself. To repeat Lenin is to repeat not what Lenin did, but what he failed to do, his missed opportunities. In the last pages of his book, trying to demonstrate how democratic subjectivity is capable of inspiring high passions, Stavrakakis refers to the other Lacanian jouissance, a jouissance beyond accumulation, domination, and fantasy, an enjoyment of the not all or not whole. How do we achieve this jouissance? By way of accomplishing the sacrifice of the phantasmatic objet petit a, which can only make this other jouissance attainable. The central task in psychoanalysis and politics is to detach the objet petit a from the signifier of the lack in the other, to detach anti-democratic and post-democratic fantasy from the democratic institutionalization of lack, making possible the access to a partial enjoyment beyond fantasy. Only thus shall we be able to really enjoy our partial enjoyment, without subordinating it to the cataclysmic desire of fantasy. Beyond its dialectics of disavowal, this is the concrete challenge the Lacanian left addresses to us. The underlying idea is astonishingly simplistic. In total contradiction to Lacan, Stavrakakis reduces the objet petit a to its role in fantasy. The objet a is that excessive X, which magically transforms the partial objects, which occupy the place of the lack in the other, into the utopian promise of the impossible fullness of jouissance. What Stavrakakis proposes is thus the vision of a society in which desire functions without an objet a, without the destabilizing excess which transforms it into a cataclysmic desire of fantasy. As Stavrakakis puts it in a symptomatically tautological way, we should learn to really enjoy our partial enjoyment. For Lacan, on the contrary, the objet a is another name for the Freudian partial object, which is why it cannot be reduced to its role in fantasy, which sustains desire. It is for this reason that, as Lacan emphasizes, one should distinguish its role in desire and in the drive. Following Jacques-Alain Miller, a distinction has to be introduced here between two types of lack, the lack proper and the whole. Lack is spatial, designating a void within a space, while the whole is more radical. It designates the point at which this spatial order itself breaks down, as in the black hole in physics. Therein resides the difference between desire and drive. Desire is grounded in its constitutive lack, while drive circulates around a hole, a gap in the order of being. In other words, the circular movement of the drive obeys the weird logic of the curved space, in which the shortest distance between 2 points is not a straight line, but a curve. The drive knows that the shortest way to attain its aim is to circulate around its goal object. One should bear in mind here Lacan's well-known distinction between the aim and the goal of the drive. While the goal is the object around which the drive circulates, its true aim is the endless continuation of this circulation as such. Miller also proposed a Benjaminian distinction between constituted anxiety and constituent anxiety, which is crucial with regard to the shift from desire to drive. While the first designates the standard notion of the terrifying and fascinating abyss of anxiety which haunts us, its infernal circle which threatens to draw us in, the second stands for the pure confrontation with the objet petit a as constituted in its very loss. Miller is right to emphasize here two features. The difference which separates constituted from constituent anxiety concerns the status of the object with regard to fantasy. In a case of constituted anxiety, the object dwells within the confines of a fantasy, whereas we get the constituent anxiety only when the subject traverses the fantasy and confronts the void, the gap, filled up by the phantasmatic object. However, clear and convincing as it is, this formula of Miller's misses the true paradox, or rather the ambiguity, of the objet a. When he defines the objet a as the object which overlaps with its loss, which emerges at the very moment of its loss, so that all its phantasmatic incarnations, from breasts to voice and gaze, are metonymic figurations of the void, of nothing. He remains within the horizon of desire, The true object cause of desire is the void filled in by its phantasmatic incarnations. While, as Lacan emphasizes, the objet A is also the object of the drive, the relationship is here thoroughly different. Although in both cases the link between object and loss is crucial, in the case of the objet A as the object cause of desire, we have an object which is originally lost, which coincides with its own loss, which emerges as lost. While in the case of the objet A as the object of the drive, the object is directly the loss itself. In the shift from desire to drive, we pass from the lost object to loss itself as an object. That is to say, the weird movement called drive is not driven by the impossible quest for the lost object. It is a push to directly enact the loss, the gap, cut distance itself. There is thus a double distinction to be drawn here, not only between the objet A and its phantasmatic and post-phantasmatic status, but also within this post-phantasmatic domain itself, between the lost object cause of desire and the object loss of drive. The startling thing is that Stavrakakis' idea of sustaining desire without the objet A contradicts not only Lacan, but also Leclau's notion of hegemony. Leclau is on the right track when he emphasizes the necessary role of the objet A in rendering an ideological edifice operative. In hegemony, a particular empirical object is elevated to the dignity of the thing. It starts to function as the stand-in for, the embodiment of, the impossible fullness of society. As we have noted, he refers to Joan Kopiec, comparing hegemony to the breast value attached to partial objects, which stand in for the incestuous maternal thing, breast. Leclau should in fact be criticized here for confounding desire, sustained by fantasy, with drive, one of whose definitions is also that which remains of desire after its subject traverses the fantasy. For him, we are condemned to searching for impossible fullness. Drive, in which we directly enjoy lack itself, simply does not appear on his horizon. However, this in no way entails that, in drive, we really enjoy our partial enjoyment, without the disturbing excess. For Lacan, lack and excess are strictly correlative, the two sides of the same coin. Precisely insofar as it circulates around a whole, the drive is the name of the excess that pertains to human being. It is the too-muchness of striving which insists beyond life and death. This is why Lacan sometimes even directly identifies the drive with the objet A as surplus enjoyment. Because he ignores this excess of drive, Stavrakakis also operates with a simplified notion of traversing the fantasy, as if fantasy is a kind of illusory screen blurring our relation to partial objects. This notion fits perfectly with the common-sense idea of what psychoanalysis should do. Of course, it should liberate us from the hold of idiosyncratic fantasies and enable us to confront reality the way it effectively is. But this, precisely, is what Lacan does not have in mind. What he aims at is almost the exact opposite. In our daily existence, we are immersed in reality, structured supported by the fantasy. And this immersion is disturbed by symptoms which bear witness to the fact that another repressed level of our psyche resists this immersion. To traverse the fantasy, therefore, paradoxically means fully identifying oneself with the fantasy, namely with the fantasy which structures the excess, resisting our immersion into daily reality. Or, to quote a succinct formulation by Richard Boothby, traversing the fantasy thus does not mean that the subject somehow abandons its involvement with fanciful caprices and accommodates itself to pragmatic reality, but precisely the opposite. The subject is submitted to that effect of the symbolic lack that reveals the limit of everyday reality. To traverse the fantasy in the Lacanian sense is to be more profoundly claimed by the fantasy than ever, in the sense of being brought into an ever more intimate relation with that real core of the fantasy that transcends imagining. Boothby is right to emphasize the Janus-like structure of a fantasy. A fantasy is simultaneously pacifying, disarming, providing an imaginary scenario which enables us to endure the abyss of the other's desire, and shattering, disturbing, inassimilable into our reality. The ideologico-political dimension of this notion of traversing the fantasy was rendered clear by the unique role the rock group Top Lista Nadrealista the top list of the Surrealists, played during the Bosnian War in besieged Sarajevo. Their ironic performances, which, in the midst of the war and hunger, satirized the predicament of the Sarajevo population, acquired a cult status not only in counterculture, but also among the citizens of Sarajevo in general. The group's weekly TV show went on throughout the war and was extremely popular. Instead of bemoaning the tragic fate of the Bosnians, they daringly mobilized all the cliches about the stupid Bosnians, which were a commonplace in Yugoslavia, fully identifying with them. The point thus made was that the path of true solidarity leads through direct confrontation with the obscene racist fantasies which circulated in the symbolic space of Bosnia, through playful identification with them, not through the denial of these obscenities in the name of what people are really like. No wonder, then, that when Stavrakakis tries to provide some concrete examples of this new politics of partial enjoyment, things become really bizarre. He starts with Marshall Sahlins' thesis that the Paleolithic communities followed a Zen road to affluence. Although deeply marked by divisions, exchange, sexual difference, violence, and war, they lack the shrine of the unattainable, of infinite needs, and thus the desire for accumulation. In them, enjoyment seems to be had without the mediation of fantasies of accumulation, fullness, and excess. They do show that another world may, in principle, be possible, insofar as a detachment of partial enjoyment from dreams of completeness and phantasmatic desire is enacted. Doesn't something similar happen in the psychoanalytic clinic? And isn't this also the challenge for radical democratic ethics? Again, is the idea here not precisely that of a society without lack? The way the Paleolithic tribesmen avoided accumulation was to cancel lack itself. It is the idea of such a society without the excess of infinite needs which is properly utopian, the ultimate fantasy, the fantasy of a society before the fall. What then follows is a series of examples of how political theorists and analysts, economists, and active citizens, some of them directly inspired by Lacanian theory, are currently trying to put this radical democratic orientation to work in a multitude of empirical contexts. For example, a group of cooperative workers, Byrne and Healy, have examined and tried to restructure their enjoyment in a non-phantasmatic way. It would be certainly interesting to hear in detail how this restructuring was carried out. Then comes Robin Blackburn's proposal for the democratization of pension funds, Roberto Unger's proposal to pass from a family to a social inheritance system, Tony Negri's proposal for a minimum citizenship income, the projects of participatory budgets in Brazil. What all this has to do with jouissance féminine remains a mystery. The vague underlying idea is that in all these cases we are dealing with modest pragmatic proposals, with partial solutions which avoid the excess of radical utopian re-foundation. Definitely not enough to qualify them as cases of jouissance féminine, which is precisely Lacan's name, for absolute excess. Stavrakakis' attempt to relate Lacanian concepts like feminine jouissance, the signifier of the lack in the other, and so on, to concrete socio-political examples is thus thoroughly unconvincing. When he quotes Joan Kopiak's precise thesis on how suppléance allows us to speak well of our desire, not by translating jouissance into language, but by formalizing it in a signifier that does not mean it, but is, rather, directly enjoyed. He reads it as a way to think of enjoyment and the production of a signifier of lack in a democratic perspective. But does Kopiak's description not also perfectly fit nationalism? Is the name of the nation not such a suppléance? When a passionate patriot exclaims, "America," does he thereby not produce a signifier, which does not translate jouissance into language, but formalizes it in a signifier that does not mean it, but is, rather, directly enjoyed? Stavrakakis' political vision is vacuous. It is not that his call for more passion in politics is in itself meaningless. Of course, the contemporary left needs more passion. The problem is rather that it resembles all too much the joke quoted by Lacan about a doctor asked by a friend for free medical advice. Unwilling to give his services without payment, the doctor examines the friend and then calmly states, "You need medical advice." Paradoxically, for all his justified critique of Freudo-Marxism, Stavrakakis' position can be designated as Freudo-radical democracy. He remains within Freudo-Marxism, expecting psychoanalysis to supplement the theory of radical democracy in the same way Wilhelm Reich, amongst others, expected psychoanalysis to supplement Marxism. In both cases, the problem is exactly the same. We have the appropriate social theory, but what is missing is the subjective factor. How are we to mobilize people so that they will engage in passionate political struggle? Here, psychoanalysis enters, explaining what libidinal mechanisms the enemy is using. Reich tried to do this for fascism, Stavrakakis for consumerism and nationalism, and how the left can practice its own politics of jouissance. The problem is that such an approach is an ersatz political analysis. The lack of passion in political praxis and theory should be explained in its own terms. That is, in the terms of political analysis itself. The true question is, what is there to be passionate about? Which political choices fit people's experience as realistic and feasible? The moment we pose the question in this way, the contours of our ideological constellation appear in a different manner, underlining W.B. Yeats's famous lines, "The best lack all conviction, while the worst are full of passionate intensity." These lines seem to offer a perfect description of the current split between anemic liberals and impassioned fundamentalists. The best are no longer able fully to engage, while the worst engage in racist, religious, sexist fanaticism. Are, however, the terrorist fundamentalists, be they Christian or Muslim, really fundamentalists in the authentic sense of the term? Do they really believe? What they lack is a feature that is easy to discern in all authentic fundamentalists, from Tibetan Buddhists to the Amish in the US. The absence of resentment and envy, deep indifference towards the non-believer's way of life. If today's so-called fundamentalists really believe that they have found their way to truth, why should they feel threatened by non-believers? Why should they envy them? When a Buddhist encounters a Western hedonist, he hardly condemns the latter. He just benevolently notes that the hedonist's search for happiness is self-defeating. In contrast to true fundamentalists, terrorist pseudo-fundamentalists are deeply bothered, intrigued, fascinated by the sinful life of non-believers. One senses that, in fighting the sinful other, they are fighting their own temptation. This is why the so-called Christian or Muslim fundamentalists are a disgrace to true fundamentalism. It is here that Yeats's diagnosis falls short of the present predicament. The passionate intensity of a mob bears witness to a lack of true conviction. Deep inside themselves, terrorist fundamentalists also lack true conviction. Their violent outbursts are proof. How fragile the belief of a Muslim must be if he feels threatened by a stupid caricature in a low-circulation Danish newspaper. Fundamentalist Islamist terror is not grounded in the terrorist conviction of their superiority and in their desire to safeguard their cultural religious identity from the onslaught of global consumerist civilization. The problem with fundamentalists is not that we consider them inferior to us, but rather that they themselves secretly consider themselves inferior. This is why our condescending, politically correct assurances that we feel no superiority towards them only makes them more furious and feeds their resentment. The problem is not cultural difference, their effort to preserve their identity, but the opposite fact that the fundamentalists are already like us, that secretly they have already internalized our standards and measure themselves by them. This clearly goes for the Dalai Lama, who justifies Tibetan Buddhism in the Western terms of the pursuit of happiness and the avoidance of pain. Paradoxically, what fundamentalists really lack is precisely a dose of that true racist conviction of one's own superiority. It would be instructive to refer here to Rousseau, who described the inversion of the libidinal investment from the object to the obstacle, which prevents our access to the object. This is why egalitarianism itself should never be accepted at face value. The notion and practice of egalitarian justice, insofar as it is sustained by envy, relies on the inversion of the standard renunciation accomplished to benefit others. I am ready to renounce it, so that others will also not be able to have it. Far from being opposed to the spirit of sacrifice, evil is thus the very spirit of sacrifice itself, ready to ignore one's own well-being, if, through my sacrifice, I can deprive the other of his jouissance. And do we not encounter the same negative passion also in politically correct multicultural liberalism? Is its inquisitorial pursuit of the traces of racism and sexism in the details of personal behavior not in itself indicative of the passion of resentment. Fundamentalism's passion is a false one, while anemic liberal tolerance relies on a disavowed perverse passion. The distinction between fundamentalism and liberalism is sustained by a shared underlying feature. They are both permeated by the negative passion of resentment.